What are you all doing here? Good afternoon, baby seals. This is Sam Vaknin, author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a professor of psychology in the Center for International Advanced Professional Studies, outreach program of the SIAS Consortium of Universities. Satisfied? Then we can move forward into the topic of today's video, which is essentially intermittent reinforcement. Now, we tend to think of intermittent reinforcement in a very stereotypical way, but actually, many behaviors, many decisions, many choices have to do with intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a very all-pervasive phenomenon in a multiplicity of relationships, not all of them abusive, dysfunctional, and pathological. But let's start with a definition, of course, because I'm an academic, and academics define before they discuss. What is intermittent reinforcement? Intermittent reinforcement involves two people at least, but not necessarily only two. You can have intermittent reinforcement on a collective level. The government can engage in intermittent reinforcement. Social media companies do it all the time. Intermittent reinforcement is when a receiving party, aka victim in intimate relationships, a receiving party receives regular signals, messages, and treatment which are cruel, callous, abusive, disempathic, indifferent, and so on. I repeat, when there is a receiving party, a recipient, who is subject to behaviors or treatment or decisions or choices which on the surface appear to be sadistic, cruel, callous, abusive, disempathic, etc., etc. And then, every once in a while, there's a display of extreme affection. Interspersed with the abuse, there are instances of reward. This is very unsettling. It's discombobulating. Look it up. When you are subjected to an endless stream of abuse, you know what to expect. You know the rules of the game. You know all the ropes. You prepare yourself mentally and physically. But what do you do when abuse is then gives place to love? Love succumbs to pain. Pain follows affection. Affection results in hurt. What do you do when the signaling is inconsistent? What do you do when you keep receiving mixed signals? Information bits that contravene each other. What do you do when your data don't fit in neat frameworks? How do you interpret the world? How do you make sense of anything and everything that's happening? What's the meaning of such behavior? Hot and cold. A behavior that at one time tells you you're nothing, you're an object, you are filth, you're unworthy, you're bad, you're corrupt, you're stupid, you're inadequate, a bad object signaling. And then suddenly it gives place to the most warm, empathic, understanding, accepting succor. How do you reconcile these two streams of messages? The answer is you don't, and it gives rise to traumatic bonding. But intermittent reinforcement is often described in the literature in a very one-dimensional, caricaturistic way. Intermittent reinforcement is much more deep, complex and pervasive than we imagine. Let us examine two phenomena. False hope, giving someone false hope, and then withdrawing this hope, and then giving hope again. That's a form of intermittent reinforcement. Anytime you give anyone a reason to hope, a reason to get up in the morning, a raison d'être, a reason to exist, and then you take it away, you are engaging, however unwittingly, in intermittent reinforcement. Another phenomenon which many of you may be acquainted with from my videos is approach avoidance repetition compulsion. Repetition compulsions in general, but especially approach avoidance, they're forms of intermittent reinforcement. The borderline personality frequently engages in this. People with borderline personality disorder frequently approach and then avoid because they are subject to the twin anxieties, engulfment anxiety versus abandonment anxiety. They approach in order to allay, to mitigate abandonment anxiety, and then they avoid in order to calm down and ameliorate the engulfment anxiety. This approach avoidance, I hate you, don't leave me, I love you, I want you dead, these messages, conflicting messages from borderlines, they are forms of intermittent reinforcement. Indeed, many partners of borderlines and partners of even codependents describe the relationship as a kind of trauma, and the bonding is especially intense because the person who causes you pain is the only person who can take it away. The person who has locked you into a position of hurt and agony and uncertainty and indeterminacy and fear and stress, the person who locked you into this is the only one who's holding the key to release you from it. Intermittent reinforcement is an attribution error. You tend to think that only the person who had mistreated you can make it all go away with a kiss. And so there are four types of intermittent reinforcement. Fixed interval schedule, FI, very common in relationships. The abuser awards the victim the reinforcement. Reinforcement is simply behavior or a message which alters or modifies your behavior. When you're subject to reinforcement, which is positive, you're likely to repeat the behavior that elicited the positive reinforcement more. And when you're subject to a negative reinforcement, it's likely to inhibit the behavior that had produced it or had led to it. So the abuser awards the victim a reinforcement. Think of it as a cookie or a candy. So he awards reinforcement after a specific interval, a specific period from the last reinforcement. And usually it's a fixed interval. This is also known as partial intermittent reinforcement. So every 2 weeks, on the dot, according to schedule, there is a tradition of positive reinforcement following 2 weeks of harrowing harassment and punitive actions and fear and pain inflicted on the victim. The victim then learns to survive these 2 weeks in order to reach the final point where she is awarded with something, a candy. The abuser waits for a specific time to offer, for example, affection or understanding or attention or a listening ear or a shoulder to cry on. And this causes the victim to display slower reactions after the reinforcement behavior. In the presence of this kind of reinforcement, the victim becomes inured, more tolerant, inured to the abuse. As the time passes, the victim develops abuse tolerance, the same way alcoholics develop alcohol tolerance. This is the fixed interval schedule intermittent reinforcement. There's another type known as variable interval schedule intermittent reinforcement. The reinforcement reward, the gift, the candy, the soothing come after a time that is unpredictable, a time that is variable from the previous time that had elapsed. The victim receives the reinforcement by surprise. It's abrupt, it's sudden, it's not scheduled, and therefore it is much stronger, much more potent. Such cases increase the anticipation of the reward and the affection. The victim becomes addicted to the reinforcement. The victim tolerates abuse of any kind from their partner in order to get this spontaneous relief, because intermittent reinforcement is about building up your anxiety, your stress, your fear, and then relieving it with a kind word, with a touch, with a smile. It's cruel. There's nothing more cruel than intermittent reinforcement, except possibly listening to my videos. And then there's the fixed ratio schedule intermittent reinforcement. In fixed ratio schedule intermittent reinforcement, the abuser delivers an affectionate display after several responses. The abuser is actually focused on the victim's response. He wants to get a rise out of the victim. He wants to elicit the kind of reaction in the victim that is discernible and visible. So the victim continues to produce higher and higher rates of responsiveness until they get their reward. Clinically speaking, this is Pavlovian conditioning. Pain is inflicted and it gets attached in the victim's mind to an ultimate reward. So the victim learns to actually anticipate the pain, want the pain, crave the pain, in order to finally benefit from, joyfully, the offered reward. Behavior pauses, and the victim continues the same pattern after the following abuse incident. And finally, there's the variable ratio schedule, intermittent reinforcement. The reinforcement is awarded after a variable number of responses in the variable ratio schedule intermittent reinforcement. Remember that the previous variation, the fixed ratio schedule intermittent reinforcement, is when the abuser provides a reward after a fixed number of responses, let's say 5. The victim has to respond 5 times, for example, by crying, or begging, or supplicating, or self-harming. And then the abuser provides the reward. And again, the reward could be a smile, could be a kind word, could be a tiny gift or a big gift, but there's always a reward. And in the fixed ratio schedule, this has to do with a fixed number of responses. Naturally, in the variable ratio schedule, the reinforcement, the reward, the award, come after a variable number of responses. Once the abuser would comfort you and soothe you and hold you and love you and lick away your tears after 3 times of crying, after 3 events of crying. And then next time he would do it after 7 lachrymose incidents. There's no predictability. There's no way to tell. There's no way to prepare yourself. The abuser offers affection faster or delays the affection at his or her sole discretion. And this in turn causes the victim to display a high and steady rate or response upon receiving the reinforcement. All these have devastating consequences on the body, hormonally and otherwise. Ultimately, these behaviors wear down the victim. Victim becomes kind of zombified and much more amenable to manipulation, which is precisely the idea behind intermittent reinforcement. Trauma bonding is about control. Watch my interview about trauma bonding on this channel. Thank you for listening. I hope I haven't traumatized you too much, and here's my smile to soothe you and comfort you down. Yes, I know. Sorry about that. See you next time. Dear colleagues, organizers, thank you for inviting me to the World Congress of Psychiatrists and Psychologists. I'm honored to be a keynote speaker. Today I would like to discuss fantasy. Fantasy defense, when it goes malignant, when it goes awry, what it does to you and what it does to others around you. My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm a professor of psychology in Southern Federal University, Rostov-on-Don, Russia, and I'm a professor of finance and a professor of psychology in the outreach program of SIAP's Center for International Advanced and Professional Studies. Before I start, it's important to understand that fantasy tends to metastasize. Fantasy co-opts and hijacks every resource available to the individual. Fantasy takes over emotions, affect, cognitions, memories, psychosexuality, and even one's own identity. Fantasy is addictive. It's anxiolytic, mitigates anxiety. It is safe. It buttresses the fantast's grandiosity, self-idealization. Actually, each of these dimensions of personality and functioning is mediated via the fantasy, is colored by the fantasy, and is distorted by the fantasy. And gradually, all direct contact with and inner experience of one's psychological world and the world around, they're lost. A robotic zombie emerges from within the fantastic space, regulated by its narrative. And so today I would like to explore 4 cases of fantasy, starting with trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is a widely misunderstood concept. Today, most people, especially self-styled experts online, describe trauma bonding as a form of extreme attachment fostered by traumatizing intermittent reinforcement. Hot and cold, good and bad, love you, hate you, ambivalence. This supposedly creates trauma bonding. If you stop to think of it for a minute, you will see how ridiculous this is. Why would such behavior create bonding? It's because trauma bonding is way more than that. Much more than that. This is why it is nearly impossible to disentangle trauma bonding, to reverse trauma bonding. Trauma bonding involves re-traumatization. The abuser triggers, reactivates unresolved conflicts from the target's or from the victim's early childhood. Joanne Lachkar calls it archaic wounds, based on Freud and other early psychoanalysts. The abuser engenders a multi-layered and multidimensional resonance of unrequited pain and existential angst, both old and new. It's like replicating the past. It's like time travel. And by doing so, the abuser assumes a maternal role. He becomes a mother, regardless of his gender. Even a man becomes a mother. He assumes a maternal role within a shared fantasy. At first, during the love bombing and grooming phases, and then a bit later on. So during the love bombing and grooming phases, the abuser becomes a surrogate mother. He promises unconditional love via idealization of the target or the victim. He idealizes the target of the victim, and then he gives the victim access to the idealized image. This is perceived by the victim as a form of unconditional love. You love me no matter what. You see me as perfect. It's addictive. It's difficult to break. But then, at a later stage, the very same abuser becomes what Andre Green called a dead mother, a selfish, immature, withholding, insecure, and aggressively rejecting mother. This pendulum, this abrupt switching between I'm your mother, I'm your loving mother, I idealize you, I see you as perfect, I love you as perfect, you should love yourself as a perfect being. This is the first message. And then the later message is, I reject you, you are imperfect, you're flawed, you're inferior. So the transition, the abrupt transition between these two messages is what creates trauma bonding. This is the reason for trauma bonding. Who can give up on her real life mother? Who can give up even on her reactivated, simulated mother introject? It's difficult to give up on mother in any way, shape or form, symbolically or in real life. It's like getting rid of a big part of one's self. The abuser gives his victim or target a second chance. It's a second chance at righting all the wrongs of childhood. It's a second chance at resolving conflicts. It's a second chance at attaining and receiving unconditional love. It's a second chance at being seen, at being noticed. And not only being seen, but being seen as a perfect, idealized, flawless object. No one can give up on that. So bonding sets in. And this is what we call trauma bonding. It's a reaction to a fantasy. In this case, trauma bonding, exactly like narcissism, is a fantasy defense gone awry. But it's a fantasy defense of the victim. What is fantasy? Fantasy is a defense mechanism so powerful that it can give rise to severe mental health issues, such as narcissistic personality disorder, as well as to cognitive deficits and distortion, and an impaired reality testing. This is the power of fantasy. The power of fantasy is to usurp reality and to replace it with something else, which appears to be as realistic and plausible as the world. Fantasies are either compensatory, you can't get the real thing, so you fantasize about getting it, or fantasies could be inhibitory. You're afraid to pursue the real thing, so you fantasize about it. All fantasies, therefore, are in some way healthy or normal, regardless of their contents, because they help us cope with harsh, unpalatable, unacceptable reality. But when fantasy goes too far, it degenerates into all kinds and forms of mental illness. Schizotypy is psychological neoteny. It involves regression to pre-self childhood, when the self is either not constellated or not integrated, when boundaries are fuzzy, boundaries are blurred, and there is a confusion between external and internal objects. Creativity and imagination are enhanced and predispose to fantasy. And so fantasy, as I said, tends to metastasize. I repeat, it co-opts, it hijacks every resource available to the individual, his emotions, affect, cognitions, memories, psychosexuality, even his or her identity. It is addictive, it's anxiolytic, because it is safe. It buttresses the fantas grandiosity, self-idealization, because it restores a sense of inner locus of control. You control the fantasy, you can't control reality. You control internal objects that represent people. You can't control the people that gave rise to these objects. Actually, each of these dimensions of personality co-opted and hijacked by fantasy. Each of these types of functions, they're all mediated via the fantasy. They're colored by it, they're distorted by it, and gradually all direct contact with the inner experiences of one psychological world is lost. The emotional investment, the cathexis in fantasy, is total, and it comes at the expense of the person's reality testing. We can easily spot the captives of fantasy. They avoid reality. They opt for substitutive action. Their self-reported emotions, hopes, wishes, and dreams starkly contradict their actions. And so we can have a client who says, for example, I crave intimacy, I love sex, and I seek love in a committed relationship, but at the same time, he chooses mostly objectifying sex with strangers or emotionally unavailable partners as a dominant practice. His intimate liaisons devolve into sexlessness, cheating, and dissolution. The praxis contradicts the declaration. Such a person also selects only inappropriate and incompatible, and therefore temporary mates, who do not constitute a threat to the integrity and longevity of the fantasy by diverging from it, by undermining the idealized, largely imagined snapshot. The intrusion of fantasy into all areas of life, even casual ones, like for example casual sex, renders fantasy largely autoerotic and solipsistic. Only a small minority of participants of both genders in fantasy actually consummate the fantasy, bodily or spiritually or psychologically. So this is trauma bonding. Let's take another type of fantasy, another case study. Identity disturbance. Cluster B patients suffer from identity disturbance. They are lifelong disappearing acts. They're emptinesses. They're pivoted on an empty schizoid core. There's nobody there. Cluster B patients are not a presence, they are an absence. The abuse of substances helps these patients to suspend their existence, to not be themselves for a few hours, especially around other people in social and sexual contexts. They leverage substances and they abuse them in order to obtain a persistent state of dissociation, a dissociative hiatus in life. Because cluster B patients are essentially nothing but dead voids. They feel alive and existent only when they are not themselves. When they are, for example, inebriated, intoxicated, wasted, drugged, or when they act out, or when they switch into other self-states. For example, the borderline switches into a secondary psychopath. The narcissist switches into his grandiose false self. These clients, these patients, they feel alive only when they symbolically kill themselves. But not being oneself, denying oneself, migrating to other self-states which are essentially not you, these become a habit. And many of these people forget how to be themselves. Being themselves feels so alien, so sad, so dull, even vaguely menacing, that they avoid being themselves assiduously and for as long as they can. Gradually, incrementally, this overwhelming need to not be oneself by, for example, abusing substances, this overwhelming need to deny oneself, to suspend oneself, this need impacts all fields of life. The workplace, career, relationships, and family included. Another problem is that when these patients are not themselves, when they are, for example, drunk, predators of all types, sexual and emotional, take advantage of these patients. They gain access to their bodies, minds, and material possessions. They use these patients contemptuously, and then they discard them. And these repeated humiliations, rejections, and exploitation exacerbate the underlying conditions, induce anxiety and depression, and push the patient inexorably to harm herself and to escalate even further her attempts to vanish down the road to self-annihilation, down the rabbit hole, down the black hole. Let's consider another manifestation of fantasy, the fantasy defense. Case 3, fantastic grandiosity. Fantasy involves cognitive deficits. It involves cognitive distortions. Ironically, the narcissist's grandiosity fantasy defense is less rigid than the grandiosity of either the borderline or the psychopath. Throughout his life, the narcissist is subjected to a barrage of narcissistic injuries and narcissistic mortifications. these challenges remold or entirely suspend his false self, the locus of his grandiose self-perception. Psychopaths and borderlines do not experience any undermining of their variance of self-aggrandizement. Narcissists do. Consequently, the grandiosity of borderlines and psychopaths is immutable, not amenable to any process of learning or modification via intrusions from countervailing harsh reality. The narcissist is much more flexible in this sense, is much less rigid. And that's because the narcissist's fantasy defense is outward oriented. Its main goal is to obtain narcissistic supply, so the narcissist must be alert and attuned to the vicissitudes in supply and in sources of supply around him. In other words, the narcissist must be embedded in the world in some respects, much more than the borderline or the psychopath. But all three share a fantasy of grandiosity. And this fantasy of grandiosity dictates their lives, shapes their lives. This fantasy of grandiosity is the one which triggers self-states and pseudo-identities. This fantasy of grandiosity dictates, or at least determines, which emotions and which cognitions will come to the fore and become conscious. They are molded and they are. Narcissists, psychopaths, and borderlines are reifications of the fantasy defense. Let's talk about a specific type of fantasy, usually common among narcissists. It's the shared fantasy. The term shared fantasy was coined by F. Sander, S-A-N-D-E-R, in 1989, in his article titled Shared Unconscious Conflicts, Marital Disharmony and Psychoanalytic Therapy, published in J. Oldham and R. Liebert as editors of The Middle Years, New Psychoanalytic Perspectives, New Haven, Connecticut, Yale University Press, pages 160 to 176. Okay, that's the reference for shared fantasy. What is a shared fantasy? The narcissist's ability to engage in a shared fantasy rests on three pillars. The environment has to be rootless, easy to discard, fantastic or dreamlike in order to uphold this grandiosity, timeless, a perception of an eternal present so that actions do not bear consequences because there's no future, and boundless, no limit to what can be done or accomplished. So the environment is a first precondition for the emergence of a shared fantasy. The circumstances ought to be right, conducive to grandiose fantasies by yielding lots of money, sex, power, access, fame, celebrity or notoriety effortlessly. In this sense, there is a psychopathic tinge or a psychopathic undercurrent in the shared fantasy. The narcissist expects to reap the rewards of the circumstantial rewards with no commensurate investment or commitment. The last and most important element, of course, in the shared fantasy is the intimate partner, the narcissist partner in constructing the folie à deux, the mass psychogenic illness of the shared fantasy. The partner in the shared fantasy has to be present to avoid abandonment anxiety, has to be submissive, fawning, adulating, playful or childlike, and has to be mothery or fathering, for example, as a business associate. The partner has to be addicted to the narcissist. So once the narcissist comes across the perfect confluence of environment, circumstances, and partner, he establishes a fantastic space. And then he invites the partner into this fantastic space via the love bombing and grooming phase. One major element in the fantastic space is, of course, the idealized image of the partner. The narcissist exposes the partner to this idealized image in order to foster addiction. The partner becomes addicted to seeing herself via the narcissist's eyes. And then she's hooked, and then she's in, and then she's a participant in the shared fantasy. Borderlines, also have shared fantasies. They have three types, actually, of shared fantasy: the fairy godmother fantasy, the princess fantasy, and the damsel in distress fantasy. Each fantasy hails a different type of intimate partner. The fairy godmother attracts beneficiaries of largesse. The princess fantasy attracts a fawning subject, and the damsel in distress attracts rescuers and saviors. The borderline, exactly like the narcissist, takes a snapshot and she introjects via introjection. She takes a snapshot of her intimate partner, but as a persecutory object. So her snapshot actually initially devalues the intimate partner, while the narcissist's snapshot of his potential partner idealizes the partner. That's a major difference between borderline dynamics and narcissistic dynamics. In the borderline's mind, the intimate partner has the power to engulf her, has the power to harm her, has the power to cause her pain. So the snapshot would be tinged with fear and dread and rejection and resentment and disappointment and hatred even. It would be a persecutory object, and this inexorably leads to decompensation and acting out, the equivalent of narcissistic mortification. We can call it borderline mortification. The narcissist shared fantasy involves perfect love, adulation. It attracts intimate partners who are willing to play the roles of fan, playmate, and mother. The narcissist first snapshots his intimate partner as an idealized object, and then, as she diverges from the snapshot, converts her into a persecutory object, which induces mortification. Discrepancies in the shared fantasy provoke the narcissist to become a primary factor 1 psychopath. Discrepancies in the shared fantasy provoke the borderline to become a factor 2 secondary psychopath. Recklessness and fantasy are both clinical features of borderline personality disorder, and in some respects also of psychopathy. Fantasy characterizes the borderline's intimate relationships as well as it does with the narcissist. But her self-destructiveness, the borderline's self-destructiveness, her emotional dysregulation, her mood lability are such that she always sabotages what she has. As reality intrudes on the fantasy, which the borderline finds intolerable and anxiety-inducing, she begins to devalue the partner. She acts out egregiously, and the resulting deterioration in the quality of the bond justifies bouts of misbehavior, for example, cheating on the partner and reckless self-trashing on the way to a new man with the next fantasy. And like the schizoid and like the narcissist, the borderline has fantasies and intrusive dreams of socially condemned sex. She recklessly places herself repeatedly in harm's way in reality. To counter the ego dystony provoked by her sexual exhibitionism and extreme sexual self-trashing, the borderline, for example, fantasizes that the man or men, multiple, even in a one-night stand or in group sex, care about her or love her. The borderline idealizes, snapshots these sexual predators and interacts with the internalized objects rather than with the brutish and revolting or even dangerous or risky reality. Borderline weaves a narrative which she knows is fictitious, but which allows her to pretend, to make believe, to dream, and therefore to act within a fantastic space. Any manifestation of kindness, an expensive date, free drinks or drugs, a place to crash in for the night, flirting and courting, attentiveness, succor, affection, or outright physical intimacy, all these are incorporated into the fantasy. All these legitimize the borderline's actions. And conversely, abuse, indifference, avoidance, nastiness, or malice render her sex problematic. She becomes sex averse because these kind of behaviors or misbehaviors shatter the fantasy. They deny her the possibility to express her core psychosexuality safely. Let's repeat this. When the borderline is exposed, for example, in a relationship with the narcissist, to abuse, indifference, avoidance, nastiness, withdrawal, absence, malice, rejection, humiliation, all these, she becomes sex averse. And she becomes sex averse because she can no longer idealize her narcissistic partner. She can no longer inhabit the shattered fantasy. And without a fantasy, she can't express her core psychosexuality safely, for example, with a partner. She can't feel egosyntonic or legitimate about her psychosexuality. And in this, the borderline differs from masochistic women and for submissive women in BDSM. And so confronted with rejection, the borderline becomes pseudo-stupid and passive-aggressive or antisocial. In other words, a secondary psychopath. When the borderline's partner is as prone to fantasy as she is, for example, when she teams up with the narcissist, or when he misreads her psychology entirely, she embarks on fantastic pseudo-relationships that are founded on sex but misinterpreted as love. Having misjudged the nature of the liaison and being faced with the exigencies of reality, the borderline again resorts to fantasy. She ends up being discarded, or she cheats on her intimate but sexless partner with a new fantasy action figure. You see the role of fantasy in all these disorders. The main role of fantasy is to allow people with cluster B personality disorders, and not only cluster B personality disorders, because this applies also to schizoid personality disorder, paranoid personality disorder. One could generalize and say that the role of fantasy in personality disorders is to allow these people to function. They are unable to function in reality. Reality impinges on very critical dimensions and determinants of their personality. Reality drives them to experience extreme pain, discomfort, ego dystony, fear. Reality creates injuries and mortifications. Reality is perceived as threatening and hostile. So they can't function in reality. They need to deny reality. They need to put a boundary or a barrier or partition between themselves and reality. And this firewall is the fantasy defense. Within the perimeter of the firewall, behind the firewall, they are able to act. They are able to act in a way that approximates, that is asymptotic to who they really are. And behind the firewall, they feel legitimized. And above all, they feel safe. This is why it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, to dismantle lifelong fantasy defenses and types of relationships with fantasy dynamics, such as trauma bonding or the shared fantasy. Thank you for listening, and I'm open now to questions. You can pose the questions on the chat, or you can pose the questions verbally. The host will take care of it, I'm sure. Thank you again. My name is Sam Vaknin, and today, as some of you who are not colorblind may notice, today I'm blue. I'm completely blue, but at least my conscience is black. Yes, I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and I'm also a professor of psychology. But not only of psychology, by the way. I also teach finance, to the detriment of banks around the world. Okay, Shoshanim. Today we're going to discuss a much neglected topic in narcissism. What else? A topic not one self-styled expert had ever touched upon, which pleases me no end. Okay, so you're all acquainted with the concept of, well, those of you who had listened, who had the misfortune of listening to my previous videos, you're acquainted by now with the concept of the empty schizoid core. At the heart of the narcissist, at the heart of the heartless narcissist, there is an emptiness, a black hole, a void, howling winds in endless corridors leading to halls of mirrors. Don't you just love my poetic twists and turns? And so this empty schizoid core, this emptiness, to borrow a phrase from Otto Kernberg, this howling void, the narcissist, believe it or not, experiences it. You can ask, if the narcissist does not exist, if the narcissist is only an absence, who does the emoting? Who does the feeling? Who is the one who is experiencing his or her own absence? Well, that is the conundrum, and this is a paradox at the heart of narcissism. There is something there, a hyperstructure, a superstructure, an entity perhaps. There's something there. I wouldn't say someone, that would be taking it too far, but there is something there that senses this emptiness. And so what the narcissist tries to do, he tries to supplant, to replace this emptiness with a semblance of existence. No one feels well. No one could feel well not being. Being is at the core of anyone's and everything's experience. In this sense, perhaps animism was right. Rocks have being, trees have being. Being is the organizing principle of reality, of the universe. And so not being is a problem. And the narcissist tries to cover up for it in a variety of ways. He tries to create ersatz, fake, impromptu, improvised types of existence. The first solution that the narcissist uses is to outsource his sense of existence. He outsources it. He derives it from others, but not only from other people, but from his pathological narcissistic space, the physical location that he is in, from his friends, from his colleagues, from institutions, from allegiance and affiliations, and so on and so forth. The narcissist leverages and uses everything around him, animate and inanimate, to outsource his sense of existence. He borrows it, so to speak, from others. In this first solution, outsourcing, the narcissist experiences existence as his own trait, as his own property, so to speak, his own quality. He does not experience it as coming from the outside. What he does, he integrates minds, places, circumstances, possessions. He takes all of these and he integrates them kaleidoscopically into a hive mind. A mind that is made of patches and shards held together precariously via grandiosity and other cognitive biases. And this is outsourcing. The outsourcing process itself is transparent to the narcissist. He does not realize what he's doing. He just feels alive. He feels that he exists, but only when he is in his pathological narcissistic space, only when he is next to his sources of supply, only when he reviews his collections and possessions or his children. So what the narcissist does not realize, the outsourcing narcissist does not realize, is that if all these were to be taken away from him, he would not feel that he exists. If all these external sources, external origins of existence, beacons of existence, were removed from his life, he would not feel that he is alive. He would not feel being. He would not feel existence. I recommend to you to watch my video on Sartre and nothingness and being. So this is the first solution, outsourcing. Outsourcing is scanning for sources and origins of existence and then incorporating them into a pastiche, into a kind of collage, into a kaleidoscope, and then owning this kaleidoscope and identifying with it to the point that it is indistinguishable from the narcissist. The narcissist feels that his existence, his being, is coming from the inside. He experiences it as any other healthy or normal person would, but what he doesn't realize, it's not coming from the inside. It's outsourced. It's outsourced just in time. It's real time. a real-time simulation. Outsourcing is the most common experience and the most common solution for the narcissist's non-being problem. But there are others. And before we go to these others, we need to dwell upon two concepts, one old and one new. Existence agents. These are the elements in the narcissist's life that provides him with a sense of existence. Each one of them contributes a minuscule or incremental piece, and when you put all of them together, existence emerges. It is an emergent property, an epiphenomenon. So the narcissist actually is a kind of device, a scanning device, and then when the information reaches a critical mass, he suddenly feels alive. And his job is to keep this critical mass at all times. Because if he goes under the critical mass, he no longer feels alive. He no longer feels that he exists. He no longer feels his being. This is intolerable. So he is busy all the time replenishing the information from existence agents. The existence agents could be people, could be places, could be circumstances, could be clubs, could be countries, could be churches, could be children, you name it. Anything, could be possessions, physical objects, material objects. Anything can and does serve as an existence agent. And it is the narcissist's role, it is what he does all day, it's a full-time job. He extracts, it's like a mining operation. It's instead of data mining, it's existence mining. He extracts his existence from all these existence agents. He puts all of these increments together and he creates an ostensibly coherent, cohesive, and congruent picture of his being. Of course, it's fake. It's fake because it doesn't emanate from the inside. It comes from the outside and is highly dependent on a continuous stream of narcissistic supply. This actually is the main role of narcissistic supply. Take away the narcissistic supply from the narcissist, take away his attention that he gets, take away adulation, admiration, even being hated, even being feared. Take away attention from the narcissist and he crumbles to dust. There's nothing there and nobody there. The narcissist is an intricate simulation. And to keep it going, there needs to be a constant power charge, not power surge. That would be narcissistic injury or narcissistic mortification, but a power charge, a constant stream, a constant current of electricity, the electricity of being, the electricity of existence. So the narcissist goes around scouting for existence agents, then co-opting them or coercing them or collaborating with them or love bombing them or grooming them or persuading them, whatever it takes, cajoling them, whatever it takes to provide him with these teeny tiny bits of existence that he can then laboriously amalgamate and put together into the picture of a being. At that point he feels that he is alive, that he is a creature in the sense that he had been created. But of course, such constant dependence creates a sense of asymmetry, a sense of imbalance, a sense of inferiority, and these are ego-dystonic. The narcissist hates being dependent. The narcissist's grandiosity and sense of superiority are challenged by this constant neediness and clinginess, which are essentially borderline features or codependent features of dependent personality disorder. In many respects, the narcissist is actually dependent. He's a codependent in many respects. So, and he hates it. He hates to be dependent on other people, on places, on circumstances, on bosses, on children. He hates to be so reliant on and so crucially dependent on these existence agents. It makes him feel bad, inferior, ego-dystonic, injured, traumatized, mortified, you name it. So the narcissist is always in a state of dysphoria. Dysphoria is one step removed from depression. And indeed, many scholars had tried to conceptualize narcissistic personality disorder as a depressive reaction to shame, the shame of being dependent, starting in early childhood, when the narcissist had been dependent on abusive, withholding, frustrating, dead, emotionally dead parents, absent and narcissistic. So some narcissists use other solutions. The second solution is substitutive existence. Remember, the first solution is outsourced existence. That is by far the most prevalent and widespread solution. Some narcissists use outsourced existence in conjunction with substitutive existence. Now, substitutive existence is very interesting. It's when the narcissist borrows other people, whole scale, full scale, wholesale, borrows them, incorporates them in his mind, and by incorporating them actually hijacks their existence. Now, two things come to mind. Many victims of narcissists describe the experience of being with a narcissist as they say, he sucks the life out of me. He's like a vampire. He sucks the oxygen out of the room. True, that's exactly what narcissists do with substitutive existence. They suck your life out of you. They take away your existence. They appropriate it, and then they assimilate it, and it becomes their existence. Your non-existence, your increasing absence, your gradual vanishing and disappearing is their rise to being. They exist more and more, the less and less you exist. It's a zero-sum game. It's you or the narcissist. And so substitutive existence is a process of snapshotting people, then incorporating them, the snapshots, photoshopping, idealizing the snapshot, and then trying to coerce the sources of the snapshot, the origin, the real person, to behave in accordance with the snapshot, to, in other words, not diverge, not deviate from the snapshot. And the narcissist will go to big extents, to a large extent, or very, very far, to ascertain that no such deviation and digression happen. So substitutive existence is actually a kind of body snatching or mind snatching, where the narcissist takes over you in order to digest you and assimilate you so that he can then derive and benefit from your self-imputed existence. Now, of course, in primitive cultures, primitive societies, ancient religions, substitutive existence was very common. For example, warriors, after a war, after a battle, they would eat the bodies of the vanquished enemy. By eating the liver of the vanquished enemy, by eating the brain of the vanquished enemy, they will have acquired the properties and qualities of the enemy. It was, and to this very day, in Catholicism, we have a process whereby the body of Christ is transformed into the wafer and the wine. So cannibalism had religious dimensions throughout human history. And so the narcissist is a cannibal. He feasts on your mind. He digests your existence. He eats you up. He eats you up. He devours you. He consumes you so that your existence, your erstwhile existence hitherto, becomes his by virtue of having assimilated you. Now, of course, this process is hampered by some narcissistic traits. For example, the narcissist's tendency to devalue meaningful and significant people in his life. You can't very well devalue someone and then treasure their separate existence or being. Devaluation stands in the way of substitutive existence, because substitutive existence requires idealization of the existence agent. You represent existence in the narcissist's life. For example, as an intimate partner, you represent existence. You have a separate being. You're real. You're alive. The narcissist wants this. He wants to take it away from you because he needs it. Because he is an absence. He's a black hole. And he doesn't want to be a black hole. He wants to be a supernova or a galaxy or a sun at the very least. And so he needs to make you disappear and reappear inside him as a form of presence, as a form of entity or a form of being. It's a very creepy process. Luckily, it is hampered, it is obstructed by his tendency to devalue you, because the minute he devalues you, you're no longer a valid source of existence. It is also hampered and obstructed by paranoia, because the narcissist's paranoia makes him hypervigilant and suspicious of you, and he would tend to be very afraid of internalizing you, converting you into an internal object or an introject, in other words, into a snapshot. It's like you're suspicious. He is paranoid of you, and so if he gets you inside his mind, you can do something bad to him. In other words, the narcissist tends to convert you into a bad persecutory object, into an enemy. And the minute you're an enemy, he won't allow you access to his mind, because you can do horrible things to his mind. So devaluation and paranoia render substitutive existence as a strategy, as a solution, very difficult to implement. The third and last type of kind of hijacked existence, or existence from the outside, is displaced existence. To summarize the previous two, outsourced existence is when the narcissist collects bits and pieces of existence from his environment and puts them together in a collage, in a pastiche, in a kaleidoscope, and then he experiences this collage, he experiences this assembly or compendium as his own existence. That's outsourced. Substitutive existence is when the narcissist internalizes whole people, complete people, intimate partners, colleagues, neighbors, friends, internalizes them, converts them into internal objects, introjects, snapshots, and then uses these to experience existence, to experience being vicariously. He actually annexes, he assimilates the existence and being of other people. This is the substitutive existence solution. And the displaced existence solution is when the narcissist recognizes that other people are separate from him, that they have their own existence and their own being, but he then somehow co-opts, somehow makes their separate existence and being his. So, for example, covert narcissists, and especially inverted narcissists, are likely to do this because they exist via others. The inverted narcissist, for example, is a subspecies of covert narcissist, and she feels alive. She feels that she exists. She feels that she is in being. She has a being. She is an entity. Only via an overt, grandiose, classic narcissist who is her intimate partner. So she is like the moon, and her intimate partner narcissist is like the sun, and she has the sun's reflected light. The moon doesn't shine, doesn't have a light of its own. It reflects the light of the sun. So it's the same in displaced existence. It's the reflected existence, the reflected being, the reflected lives of people around the narcissist. He basks in this secondary reflective source of light, source of being, source of life, source of existence. He surrounds himself with people, intimate partners, colleagues, neighbors, friends, never mind. He surrounds himself with people through whose existence he can exist. It's vicarious existence by proxy. It's if my intimate partner exists, only then do I feel that I exist. It's also common in borderline, by the way, and in codependency. Here's another thing common to narcissists, borderlines, and codependence. So displaced existence is when the narcissist makes sure that there is an existence agent or agents around him which can imbue him, endow him, bestow upon him the gift of existence. So if your intimate partner is successful, you feel successful. If your intimate partner is loving, you feel being loved, and you love the fact that you're being loved, so you love. If your intimate partner is very good with his hands, a great handyman, you take pride in this, but not pride for him, pride for yourself. It's like you own him, he's your property. You own something exotic and amazing. So this is displaced existence. And these are the three solutions. And displaced existence is obstructed and hampered and very often prevented by passive aggression and entitlement. Passive aggression is a tendency to undermine, sabotage, and destroy from the, like termites, destroy by gnawing away at the foundations and the roots of relationships. So the narcissist, the covert narcissist, passive aggression tends to deflect, tends to diminish his ability or her ability to obtain existence from people around him, from his sources. He tends to passively, aggressively destroy any possibility, any attempt, any effort, and any potential to somehow live vicariously through another person. And also entitlement. Narcissist feels entitled, and so he becomes demanding, he becomes aggressive, clinging, needy, and ultimately pushes the existence agents away. Okay, now to three of your questions. Joy asks, is there only one form of shared fantasy? Well, shared fantasy was first described in 1989 by Sander, not by Bakhnin. And ever since then, we've learned a lot about shared fantasies, especially in cluster B personality disorders, mainly narcissism and borderline. And so it seems that there are two types of shared fantasy. There is a companionship shared fantasy, and there is a submissive shared fantasy. Now, the companionship shared fantasy is common mainly among cerebral narcissists, and to some extent, covert narcissists. The submissive shared fantasy is common among overt, grandiose narcissists. So compensatory, covert, cerebral narcissists, they would create a companionship shared fantasy. Overt, grandiose, somatic narcissists, they would create a submissive shared fantasy. Now, what's the difference between these two? A companionship shared fantasy is very much like a business transaction. Indeed, it's transactional. It's an agreement. You will provide me, you, my intimate partner, will provide me with services, you will provide me with adulation, with supply, narcissistic, or if I'm a bit sadistic supply. You will provide me with supply, with attention, with adulation, with admiration. You will provide me with services, all kinds of services, I don't know. You will be my personal assistant or whatever. And I, in turn, will endow you, bestow upon you my presence. So this is the companionship shared fantasy where the intimate partner actually fulfills the roles of mother and, to some extent, fan or admirer. And in a companionship shared fantasy, the main role of the intimate partner is to provide secondary narcissistic supply. The narcissistic supply, the intimate partner witnesses the narcissist's accomplishments, records them, and releases these recordings when supply is low, helping to regulate the flow of supply. So this is in companionship shared fantasy. In submissive shared fantasy, the main emphasis is on the intimate partner as a playmate and a fan. So in submissive shared fantasy, there's a lot of sex. The demand is for sex and for supply, and only in the third place, services. The submissive shared fantasy is much more common among somatics and so on. And there, it's much less of an agreement. There's also no horizon. There are no plans. It's not serious. There's no investment. There's no commitment. There's a lot of fantasies about the future. There are many fantasies about the future. And it's all very vivid and very colorful and very convincing. And even the narcissist himself believes in these fantasies. So it's not future faking. The narcissist is not lying. He's deluding himself as well as his intimate partner. But the emphasis is on sex, usually sadistic or submissive sex, and on adulation, admiration. The narcissist wants to feel irresistible, for example, if he's a somatic narcissist. Okay, so these are the two types of shared fantasy. It's important to understand that when you misidentify sex as intimacy, when you mislabel love as pain, you end up having sexless intimacy and painful loves. I repeat this because it's a profound sentence, and it's profound because I wrote it. When you misidentify sex as intimacy, you end up having sexless intimacy. When you mislabel love as pain, you end up having painful love affairs. Profound. I admire myself, mainly because no one else would. Poor me. That's called victim stance. Okay, which leads us to trauma bonding, of course. Trauma bonding is a form of self-mutilation. It's a form of self-harm. Now, that's a very unusual view of trauma bonding because we tend to divide the participants in trauma bonding into perpetrators, abusers, predators, and hapless, flawless, angelic victims. Nothing could be further from the truth. Trauma bonding is a collaboration, a very close collaboration, where the parties contribute equally, and both of them are committed to the bond. Both of them are cathected, emotionally invested in the bond. But as far as the victim is concerned, it's a form of self-cutting, exactly like in borderline personality disorder. It's a form of self-punishment, self-destruction, self-mutilation, self-harm. And all these behaviors in borderline personality disorder, for example, all these behaviors have three functions. There are three functions to self-harm and self-mutilation. Number one, to numb, to quell, to repress dysregulated emotions that threaten to overwhelm the victim. Number two, to allow the victim to feel alive through pain. Number three, to punish, defeat, and destroy the self-mutilator. So these are the three functions of self-mutilation and self-harm. To numb dysregulated emotions that threaten to overwhelm the self-mutilator. To allow the person who self-harms to feel alive through pain. And to punish, defeat, and destroy the self-mutilator or the person who self-harms. And all three exist in trauma bonding. It's exactly what trauma bonding does. Lydia Rangelowska wrote these words recently. Our narcissistic defenses preserve us from self-destruction in desperate, hopeless, and uncertain times. The need to socialize, to compare ourselves with others, is intended to restore control over our innate urges. Having been terrified of our dark side, we actually trauma bond with others. And so others remind us that we are weak and that we have to fight for our survival. One should embrace his or her weakness in order to restore the energy, the hope, and the will to live. Others won't do it for you. It's a choice you have to make, to suffer or to live. Wise counsel indeed, and another alternative view on trauma bonding. I hope you survived and enjoyed this excursion into the dark underside of the human psyche. I'm always here to guide you through Hades. Just pay me my due. My name is Sam Vapni. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. It takes two to tango, and an equal number to sustain a long-term abusive relationship. The abuser and the abused form a kind of a bond, a dynamic, the dependence. Expressions such as folie à deux and shared psychosis, or even Stockholm Syndrome, capture facets of this dance macabre. And this dance often ends fatally. It is always an excruciatingly painful affair, but it can also turn dangerous at the least expected moment. Abuse is closely correlated with alcoholism, drug consumption, intimate partner homicide, teen pregnancy, infant and child mortality, and incest, spontaneous abortion, reckless behaviors, suicide, and the onset of mental health disorders. It doesn't help that society refuses to openly and frankly tackle this pernicious phenomenon and the guilt and shame associated with it. People, overwhelmingly women, remain in an abusive household for a variety of reasons: economic, parental, to protect the children, and psychological. But the objective obstacles facing the battered spouse, the abused spouse, cannot be overstated. The abuser treats his spouse as an object, an extension of himself, devoid of a separate existence and denuded of distinct needs, preferences, wishes, and priorities. Thus, typically, the couple's assets are all on the abuser's name, from real estate to medical insurance policies. The victim has no family or friends because her abusive partner or husband frowns on her initial independence and regards it as a threat. By intimidating, cajoling, charming, and making false promises, the abuser isolates his prey from the rest of society, and thus makes her dependent on him totally. The victim is often also denied the option to study and acquire marketable skills or augment them. Abandoning the abusive spouse frequently leads to a prolonged period of destitution and peregrination. Custody is usually denied to parents without a permanent address, a job, income security, and therefore stability. Thus, many victims stand to lose not only their mates and their nests, but also their offspring. There is the added menace of violent retribution by the abuser or his proxies, coupled with emphatic contrition on his part and a protracted and irresistible charm offensive. Gradually, many victims are convinced to put up with their spouse's cruelty in order to avoid this harrowing predicament. But there is more to an abusive diet than mere pecuniary convenience. The abuser stealthily but unfailingly exploits the vulnerabilities in the psychological makeup of his victim, the chinks in her armor. The abused party may have low self-esteem, a fluctuating sense of self-worth, primitive defense mechanisms, phobias, mental health problems, a disability, bodily or psychological, history of failure, or a tendency to blame herself or to feel inadequate, what we call autoplastic neurosis. She may have come from an abusive family or environment herself, which conditions her to expect abuse as inevitable and normal. Abuse becomes her comfort zone. In extreme and rare cases, the victim is a masochist, possessed of an urge to seek ill treatment and pain, and to revel in them. The abuser may be functional or dysfunctional, a pillar of society or a peripatetic con artist, rich or poor, young or old. There are many types of abusers. There is no universally applicable profile of the typical abuser. Yet abusive behavior often indicates serious underlying psychopathologies. Absent empathy, the abuser perceives the abused spouse only dimly and partly, as one would an inanimate source of frustration. The abuser, in his mind, interacts only with himself and with what we call introjects, representations of outside objects, such as the victims. It is a monologue, never a dialogue. So hello, I'm with Stephanie, who is a trauma expert. She will introduce herself using hopefully her full name so that you can find her online. She has a prolific Instagram presence as well, very interesting account. And I will hand over to her. Stephanie will introduce herself, and then I'll introduce myself.
Thank you so much, Sam, for introducing me and for having me here. It's such an honor to have this discussion with you. So my name, yes, is Stephanie Carina. You can find me on Instagram. I'm posting there. I'm a clinical psychologist, specialized in trauma and personality mainly. Yeah. So.
And I understand that you're based in Netherlands. If I understood correctly. You're in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. My favorite accent. Okay. I'm Sam Vaknin. Those of you who are watching this on my channel know me already and are tired of me, probably. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a professor of psychology in the universities which would have me, which is quite a few. So today we're going to discuss essentially, I believe, trauma. And more specifically, we're going to start with trauma bonding. And then Stephanie and I will have a free exchange. We'll have a conversation, in effect, about things that interest her. And maybe I'll have some new ideas. She will contribute, I will contribute, and we're going to have lots of fun. And you're invited to be witnesses to the whole thing. So we start with trauma bonding. And Stephanie is going to present 6 basic questions about trauma bonding. This is more in order to lay the groundwork so that we have a common language and an ability to communicate on this phenomenon from a common base point. And so we define the terminology and then a little of the dynamics of the whole process and so on and so forth. So again, like in tennis, over to Stephanie.
Yes. And I'm excited about this topic because this is basically a hot topic also on social media. I think a lot of people are suffering from what is called narcissistic abuse. So I'm excited to get to this topic. Could you define for us what trauma bonding is?
I'm going to use my favorite definition, the one I'm using usually in international conferences. And it's my favorite definition because it includes, I think, all the elements of trauma bonding. And it goes like that. Extreme. Trauma bonding involves extremes. Extremes of everything. Extremes of abuse, extremes of attachment, extremes of inability to extricate yourself from the bond, etc., etc. So it's extreme. Unidirectional attachment. The abused is attached to the abuser, but the abuser is not attached to the abused. Now, this is very important because this is what differentiates between trauma bonding and Stockholm syndrome. In Stockholm syndrome, we have mutual, bidirectional attachment. Both the abuser or the kidnapper or whatever and the abused are bonded with each other. In trauma bonding, it's one direction. Only the abused is attached to the abuser. And the definition continues. Fostered, created by traumatizing, unpredictable, intermittent reinforcement. Intermittent reinforcement is a fancy phrase, a clinical phrase, to describe hot and cold, loving, hating, but in an unpredictable way. The abuser wakes up in the morning and he is all flowers and caring and loving and so on. And then in the afternoon, he becomes a monster. And then the next morning, he's again love bombing and grooming and everything. And so it's impossible to predict the behavior of the abuser. And it creates what we call intermittent reinforcement. We'll discuss it a bit later. And finally, involving a power asymmetry. There must be a power asymmetry in trauma bonding. The abuser is holding all the cards. The abused is needy in the sense that she needs the abuser. So I'm going to repeat the definition. Trauma bonding is extreme, unidirectional attachment fostered by traumatizing, unpredictable, intermittent reinforcement involving a power asymmetry. And this definition is derived from what we call in psychology learning theory. Yes, there is such a thing, learning theory. It also borrows a little from behaviorism. And that's my favorite definition. But I must warn you, there are others.
Thank you for that. So what sometimes they call it an emotional attachment. So it's only a one-sided emotional attachment from that perspective. Okay.
Yes, in trauma bonding, it's one-sided. In Stockholm syndrome, it's two-sided.
Okay. So then one would ask, why stay in such an abusive relationship, right? So what are some of the dynamics in trauma bonding? Why would one stay?
I would come to why would one stay a bit later, but I think the dynamics are important. There are several extremely unusual dynamics in trauma bonding, and the reason is the abused person has a highly specific profile, a highly specific autobiographical profile. And so within trauma bonding, we find people, I hate to use the word victims, because trauma bonding is a collaboration. It's a dance macabre. There is a collusion between the abused and the abuser. The abused needs the abuser, and the abuser needs the abused. And they're working together on a joint project, which is called trauma bonding. So I hate to use, it's wrong to use the word victim, but I think abused, the abused person. The abused person has a series of confusions. For example, the abused person confuses intensity with truth. The bond in trauma bonding is very intense. So the abused says to herself, it is so intense, it must be real. Because it's so strong, it's so extreme, it must be true, it must be real. There is another confusion between attention and love. The abused person tells herself, and I'm saying herself because the majority of the abused in trauma bonding are women, and that happens to be a fact. So the abused person tells herself, he's giving me attention. It may be bad attention, it may be abusive attention, it may be violent attention, but it proves that he loves me. The fact that he is jealous when I just look at another man, it's proof that he loves me. The fact that he beat me up from within an inch of my life and I'm in a hospital, it proves that he loves me. He couldn't control himself. Actually, I provoked him. So there is a lot of confusion. And the reason the abused have all these confusions is because they dread loneliness. They have extreme separation insecurity. Separation insecurity is the clinical term for abandonment anxiety. So they have extreme abandonment anxiety, very much like a borderline. And so they dread loneliness and they lie to themselves. They say the abusive partner loves me because he pays attention to me and because he's so intense and extreme, it proves that he loves me. And then in many cases, there are coercive circumstances. The abuser isolates the prey, isolates the victim or the abused person from her family, from her social circle. He isolates it to the point that she totally depends on him, even for daily functions, let alone mental functions, psychological functions. And he creates in her the belief that she is unable to escape. He gaslights her into believing that she doesn't have any capacity to extricate herself and to walk away. He, for example, teaches her helplessness. This is called learned helplessness. He teaches her that she is helpless, she's stupid, she is inadequate, she's uneducated and ignorant. She will never make it. No one else will ever love her. She will not find a job. She should not walk away because he is her only guarantee, her only source of safety. And she buys into this story. And finally, another important dynamic is what is called betrayal trauma. Betrayal trauma was first described by Carnes, C-A-R-N-E-S, and expanded upon by a very important scholar from Stanford. The name is Jennifer Freid. And Jennifer Freid coined the phrase betrayal trauma blindness. And together with Carnes's work, there is a betrayal trauma theory. And I'm going to read to you the definition, Freud's definition of betrayal trauma. When you cannot, or when you are not allowed to express your experience of trauma and abuse, when you are not allowed to communicate the breach of trust, the disempowerment, the negative emotions, and the profound betrayal by someone that you depend on in a crucial way, such denial and repression lead to severe mental health outcomes, dependency, dissociation, and a host of other long-term mental health disorders. So all these dynamics work together in trauma bonding, which is the reason trauma bonding is by far the strongest bond and attachment we know. It's even stronger than the maternal bond to a child or a love affair. It's extremely strong and extremely difficult to break.
And so how come is it so strong, even stronger than with a relationship with the mother, childhood?
It is so strong because it fulfills all these needs. It fulfills multiple psychological needs. And because the victim learns to internalize the view of the abuser, the way the abuser sees her or wants her to see herself. So the abuser communicates to the victim, you're hopeless, you're helpless. Don't even bother to walk away. You will not survive one day without me. I'm the guarantor of your survival and well-being, and peace of mind, and everything else you need, and so on and so forth. So there is, the abuser creates total dependency. And it's very difficult for the victim to break that.
So in a way, the abuser takes over the abused person.
He takes over in multiple ways. He becomes, for example, her reality testing. In other words, the abused person loses her belief in herself. She begins to think that she is not capable of appreciating and appraising reality properly. She begins to distrust her own judgment. And so she resorts to the abuser. She asks the abuser, is this real? Am I not crazy? Can I trust my judgment in this case? What would you have done had you been me? Etc., etc. The abuser's reality testing, the abuser's judgment displaces and replaces the victim's. The abuser becomes an extension of the victim in this sense. We can say that the victim outsources her internal world, her internal processes, she outsources them to the abuser, so that the abuser becomes an external regulator. The abuser has the power to regulate the abused person's emotions, moods. And this is why many of the people in trauma bonding situations actually suffer from dysregulatory or dysregulation disorders. For example, borderline personality disorder, where the person is incapable of regulating her emotions and her labile moods by herself. She needs an external input. She needs someone from the outside to regulate her. And the dependency becomes total. Now, consequently, the victim or the abused person lies to herself because there is a cognitive dissonance. On the one hand, she is abused. She is not stupid. The abused people are not stupid. No one says they're stupid. They know that they're being abused, but they can't walk away. So this creates a dissonance. This creates a conflict. I'm in a bad situation, but I cannot help myself. So to resolve the cognitive dissonance, they lie to themselves. They rationalize what's happening. They're saying to themselves, whatever is happening to me is happening for a good reason. They justify the abuser. They say, I provoked him. I misbehaved. I had it coming. I deserve this. Or they minimize the abuse. They say, oh, it's not a big deal. So he broke my finger. It's not a big deal. 3 weeks and I'll be as right as new. So there's a minimization of the abuse. There's dissociation. Simply the abused person simply forgets, simply deletes the experience, and the memory comes back only when she's abused the next time. This is called state-dependent memory. Then there is malignant optimism, false hope. The abused person lies to herself. She says, it's going to be okay. The abuse is not very frequent. The rest of the time, he loves me. If I only get to his inner child, if I only love him properly, he's going to change. This is malignant optimism. And finally, there are autoplastic defenses. Autoplastic defenses is when you tend to blame yourself, when you tend to feel responsible for everything that's happening, when you feel guilty and ashamed about the abuse. Someone else is abusing you, and you feel that you made it happen somehow. It's a form of magical thinking. So all these mechanisms of self-deception are at work all the time. And they don't allow the victim to simply look reality in the face and say, I'm out of here. I'm not going to tolerate this anymore, because she can't see reality. She's firewalled. The abuser firewalls her. It's isolation from the outside. He cuts her off any social contacts, family and friends, and it's isolation from the inside. He cuts her off from her contact with reality.
And basically what you're describing is also gaslighting, I suppose, then.
Yes, gaslighting is a technique used by abusers to induce trauma bonding.
Exactly. So how does the victim in trauma bonding cope with this reality of abuse?
It is, there are two ways to conceptualize trauma bonding, two new ways, let's say. One way is as a fantasy defense, and the other way is as a self-harming activity. Actually, these are the two major coping mechanisms of the abused person in a trauma-bonded relationship. Either she retreats into fantasy, or she begins to harm herself by actively participating in the abusive cycle. And I will elaborate a bit, with your permission, on each one of these two. Trauma bonding is a fantasy defense. What the abuser does, he comes to the abused person, he comes to the victim, if you wish, and he says to her, I'm going to love you the way a mother loves. I'm going to love you like a mother. I'm going to play the maternal role. I'm going to idealize you, and then I'm going to give you access to the idealized image. And you will fall in love with your own idealized image through my gaze. I'm going to have a monopoly, says the abuser. I'm going to have a monopoly on your newfound self-love. I'm going to love you unconditionally the way a mother loves you, and I'm going to allow you to love yourself unconditionally by idealizing you and letting you have access to this idealized image. And they strike a deal. The abuser and the abused strike this deal. The abused says, you can do anything you want to me as long as you love me as a mother does and allow me to gain access to my idealized image, because it's addictive, it's intoxicating. And then the abuser suddenly switches. Instead of being a good enough mother, he becomes what is called in psychoanalytic literature a dead mother. He becomes a bad mother. He becomes a vicious mother, an absent mother, narcissistic mother, selfish mother. And this disorients the victim completely, because she believed that the abuser loves her. She believed that the abuser loves her the way a mother loves her child. She saw herself in the abuser's gaze, in the abuser's eyes, as an idealized infant. And suddenly he hates her. He devalues her. He attacks her. And this is exceedingly disorienting. She can't give up on this newfound so-called fantastic love. It's a chance at a second childhood. It's a chance to get things right, to resolve conflicts, to experience the kind of love that maybe she had never experienced before, and to be seen as a flawless object, and she doesn't want to let this go. But on the other hand, it's very painful because there are these constant attacks by the abuser. So what she does, she retreats into fantasy. She idealizes the abuser, and she begins to have a relationship with the idealized object in her mind that represents the abuser. So in a way, what she does, she takes a snapshot of the abuser, then she photoshops the snapshot, she converts it into an ideal image, and then she cuts off the real abuser, and she continues to interact with the representation of the abuser in her mind. She begins to have a relationship with an internal object, because the external object, the real life partner, the abuser, is too painful. The second solution is self-mutilation. We know, for example, in borderline personality disorder, when there is a lot of stress, where there is abandonment or rejection, real or imagined, the borderline self-mutilates. She cuts herself, she burns herself, or she engages in dangerous, reckless behaviors, for example, promiscuity with total strangers. These are all forms of self-harm. She harms herself. Why does the borderline harm herself? Because it's a coping mechanism, and a very effective one, very efficacious one. The abused person, the victim in trauma bonding, does exactly the same. She uses the abuser to harm herself, to mutilate herself, to damage and injure herself. Trauma bonding is a collaborative form of self-mutilation and self-harm, and it has three functions as far as the victim is concerned: to numb, to emotionally numb herself, to eliminate dysregulated emotions that threaten to overwhelm her. The emotions inside her are too strong. So by being abused, by collaborating with the abuser in a trauma bonded situation, these emotions that threaten to overwhelm her are numbed, they're suppressed, they're repressed, and she can forget about them, at least for a while. The second function is to allow her to feel alive through pain. The irony is that victims of trauma bonding often describe the drama in trauma bonding, the abuse, even the physical attacks. They describe these experiences as lively experiences. They felt alive. In other situations where there's no abuse and no pain, physical or psychological, they feel dead inside. Otto Kernberg called it the emptiness. Seinfeld, another psychoanalyst, called it the empty schizoid core. At the heart, at the nucleus, at the core of trauma-bonded victims, there is an emptiness, there is a deadness, they're dead inside. The abuser brings them back to life, revives them and resuscitates them with his dramatic antics and with his abuse. Finally, trauma-bonded abuse is intended to punish, to defeat, and to destroy the victim. It is a form of self-destructiveness. You could ask, why do the victims not walk away? One of the main reasons they don't walk away is that they hate themselves. They loathe themselves. They have a very low negative view of themselves. They have extremely low self-esteem and self-confidence and self-worth. It's not fluctuating, it's simply low. Then they want to die. They want to destroy themselves. It's nihilism. And the abuser comes handy because he offers them self-destruction and self-defeat on a silver platter.
So what you're describing is that basically this relationship gives them a kind of relief.
Yes. The relationship reduces anxiety. What many people and even scholars don't understand is that trauma bonding is anxiolytic. It reduces anxiety. The baseline of trauma victims, all trauma victims, not only bonded trauma, The baseline of trauma victims in post-traumatic conditions is extreme dysregulated anxiety. And they would do anything to reduce the anxiety. They drink, they do drugs, and some of them self-harm and self-mutilate to reduce anxiety. And one of the best ways to harm yourself is to find the wrong partner. Because if your mate selection is self-destructive, you will find a partner who will mutilate you, who will harm you, exactly like a cigarette or a knife, you know? And so these women, in most cases, they self-harm through the wrong partner, or actually the right partner for them, because they want to destroy themselves. But you see, there's another thing. The abuser creates in the victim a set of mind. He inculcates in the victim beliefs. He replaces the victim's belief system with his own belief system. And there are automatic negative thoughts, automatic sentences, negative sentences that keep circulating throughout the victim's mind. For example, I am lucky to have this abuser. I'm worthless, I'm damaged goods, I'm broken. I'm lucky to have found even this guy who is an abuser. If I leave the relationship, who else would want me? Where will I find another partner? I will never find another partner. This is a sentence, this is a message that the abuser is implanting in the mind of the victim. This process is called entraining. It's a form of brainwashing. Another sentence, the best of all worlds. The victim tells herself, life is harsh, and it doesn't get much better than this. Actually, my life is not so bad. You know, I have a relationship, I have a man, he clearly loves me because he beats me up. He's jealous. And so the grass is always greener on the other side. It's an optical illusion. My life as it is now is as good as it gets. Another sentence. My partner may be bad, but he is not worse than other partners. Every other partner I will find will have flaws. Every other partner will abuse me. Every other partner will have quirks and eccentricities. Every other partner I will have to get used to. I will have to accommodate every other partner. Better stick with what I know and what I have. No one guarantees that my next partner will not be even much worse than this one. So why not stick with this one? And finally, there's another sentence that the abuser entrains into the mind of the victim. There's no such thing as happiness. Don't pursue happiness. Happiness is for idiots. Happiness is for adolescents. Serious adults don't pursue happiness. They pursue utility and self-efficacy. Life is a serious business. It's not about being selfish. The pursuit of elusive happiness is another name for selfishness. You should meet your obligations. You should get on with it. You should move on. Yet best you can expect what I'm giving you as an abuser. That's the best you can ever get. This is happiness. Your life now is happiness. You just don't know how to identify it. You don't know how to recognize it. You're stupid. You're deficient. You're dysfunctional. You're mentally ill. You don't realize you have the best life imaginable. So all these sentences, these are negative automatic thoughts. All these sentences implanted in the victim's mind by the abuser are forms of control. They control the victim because they teach her to be hopeless and helpless. I think we should take a break now. And if you wish, we can return and have a conversation.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, I'm recording. My backup is recording. I'm recording the backup. Everything is okay. Yeah. So I'm trauma bonded to my glass of wine. And just to open the conversation, you can be trauma bonded to a substance. You can be trauma bonded to an institution. You can be trauma bonded to a parent, to a mother or father. You can be trauma bonded to a sibling. Trauma bonding simply means that you can't walk away from a situation that traumatizes you with anything. Now, an alcoholic is traumatized by the alcohol because many bad things happen to alcoholics when they drink, but they can't stop. So we could say that addiction is a subspecies of trauma bonding. Just to kick off the conversation.
So that's interesting. I never thought of it that way, but yeah. So that's any type of abuse, including the alcohol, the negative aspects of alcohol.
Yeah, wouldn't you agree that the alcohol abuses the alcoholic?
Yeah.
In many ways. I mean, horrible things happen to alcoholics. They're robbed, they're mugged, they're killed, they're absolutely horrible things. And yet they can't stop. They can't just walk away. And if you analyze the psychodynamic of addiction, you discover huge similarities with trauma bonding. Trauma bonding may be the mechanism that generates addiction, actually.
Yeah, interesting. And you were describing about the entraining process, that abuser implements beliefs, and that's why the abused stays, and with the purpose of controlling them, basically making them feel powerless and helpless to not leave. And now I realize, because I've been posting on gaslighting, now I realize why they say it's so important to leave as soon as possible, because otherwise this process gets worse and worse, and then you have totally a different belief system, and you will feel totally helpless and depressed and stay.
Very true. It's very true. And training is a relatively new concept. It was first discovered 10 years ago among musicians. Musicians were playing music together, and the brain waves of the musicians became identical. It's like they had one brain, a hive brain. And so I extended this and I said, if someone repeats the same sentence to you all the time and does it in a kind of musical way, like with the same intonation and the same inflection and the same accent, so there's music in the background, isn't training you in effect. Now, this leads to a kind of brainwashing. It uses a mechanism known as internalization introjection. Used to be called identification, but the name has changed. Internalization introjection is a very powerful mechanism where we internalize other people who are meaningful to us. So the abuser forces you to internalize him, so you have an internal object of the abuser in your mind, and then he attaches to it the verbal abuse. He attaches it to his internal object. So the internal object begins to repeat the abuse inside your mind. Simply, even when the abuser walks away, you broke up with the abuser. His voice is still inside your mind and still repeating the same sentences and the same, because he created this attachment, if you wish, between internal object and entrained sound, entrained voice. It's very powerful, extremely powerful, almost impossible to reverse. That's why you really must run away as soon as you can.
And that also makes me wonder, but perhaps we'll get there with the next question, is why does the abuser why does the abuser do this? Why is the abuser going to these lengths to do this? So in your work, you compare trauma bonding to a fantasy. Could you elaborate?
The most abusers, not all abusers, let it be clear, but most abusers suffer from mental health problems. They could be mild mental health, but they could be very serious mental health problems. For example, narcissism, which is an extremely serious mental health disorder. And so these abusers have serious problems with what we call object constancy. Abusers grow up in dysfunctional families and were exposed to dysfunctional mothers, also known as dead mothers. These are mothers who are selfish, absent, depressed, angry, neglectful, or what instrumentalize the child, parentify the child, bad mothers who don't know how to be mothers. So consequently, this child is unable to form what we call object constancy. The child becomes very insecure, very clinging, very needy, terrified when the mother leaves the room because he has no representation of the mother in his mind. And this is what is known as object constancy. So these abusers when they come across an intimate partner, they have to objectify her. They have to convert her into an object, because objects can be controlled, and objects never abandon, and objects never cause pain, and objects never frustrate, and objects are utterly controllable. So they need to objectify you immediately. And the only way to objectify you is to take away your agency, your autonomy, your independence, and your ability to act, and your trust in yourself, and in your reality testing, and in other people. They need to convert you to an ancient Egyptian mummy. There's a famous movie, Psycho, by Hitchcock, where there's a guy who owns a motel. His name is Bates, and he has a mother. His mother died. So what he does, he mummifies her. And every morning he puts her facing the window, on a chair facing the window, and every evening he comes back, goes up to the room and puts her to sleep. But she's dead, of course. That's the ideal partner of an abuser. This kind of mummy, mummified mummy, that's the ideal partner of an abuser. Abusers, consequently, create fantasies. All abusers, by the way, even abusers who are not narcissists, they all create fantasies. And they invite you into the fantasy. And once you are in the fantasy, you become a fictitious character. Because a fantasy is a movie. A fantasy is a story. It's a narrative. It's not real. And the minute you entered, you become two-dimensional, a fictitious character. And then, of course, the author, the writer of the fantasy, has the right to tell you how to behave in his story. It's his story. It's his movie. He's like a director. So he has the right to tell you how to behave. And only he has the key which can release you from the fantasy. But he will never do this. He will never release you from the fantasy. On the very contrary, he will quash you and squash you and make you more and more two-dimensional until you become a symbol, what we call an internal object. You become an introject. You lose your real life presence. You become a figment in the abuser's mind. That's why abusers, for example, have no problem to beat you up physically or to torment you verbally or psychologically, but they would never do this to other people. You know, many victims of abuse, they say, my abuser is so kind and so nice to other people. He abuses only me. And so people find it hard to believe me, because he's a pillar of the community. He's charitable, he's altruistic, he's a wonderful man, he's kind with everyone. Then he comes back home and he beats me to the point of having to go to the hospital. And no one believes that he's capable of that. Because when the abuser abuses his intimate partner, he is not abusing the external object. He's not abusing the real person. He's abusing the internal object.
And he doesn't have other internal objects. It's his partner. That's the reason.
No, he has many other internal objects, but one of them is the intimate partner. He has what we call introjects. So he has a representation of his mother, of his father, peers, teachers, role models. He has other internal objects, for example, self-states. He has all kinds of states of the self. Everyone, by the way, even healthy people, have many internal objects. But the internal object that is used to regulate some of the critical needs of the abuser is the intimate partner. So he develops a kind of sick attachment coupled with enormous anxiety. And to reduce the anxiety, he needs to prove to himself that the intimate partner is a controllable object, that the intimate partner would never walk away. He needs to make sure that she would never walk away. You know, in extreme cases, he disables her physically. He poisons her, he breaks her legs. There's a famous movie, Misery. It's a movie with, you know? So in Misery, there's a fan of a writer. She's a fan. And the writer has an accident. And the fan of this writer finds him in the snow and takes him home, to her home. And she nurses him and nurtures him until he heals. But then when he heals, he wants to walk away. He wants to return to his home. And she wouldn't have it. She breaks both his legs in order to keep him in her possession. And this is what the abuser does. Trauma bonding happens when the abused likes this process, when she needs this process, when she responds positively to this process. In the overwhelming vast majority of cases, the victim tries to run away. The victim is unhappy. She's egodystonic. She tries to extricate herself. She seeks help. She wakes up and educates herself. In the vast majority of cases, the victims have agency of some kind or another, and they try to walk away from the situation. But in a small minority of cases, the victims want this to happen. Trauma bonding is collusive and collaborative. It's not true that trauma bonding happens to kind of innocent victims. It's a collaboration. And the abused person is attached, bonded, loves the abuser because he abuses her. This is the politically incorrect, unpalatable truth. The reason she's attached to him, the reason she's bonded to him, why she loves him, is because he guarantees to her unmitigated, uninterrupted mistreatment. And she needs it for the reasons that I described before.
So that's what you're describing with fantasy from both parties, the contract, basically. So the narcissist needs this love, this validation, basically, that he never received as a child, and is afraid to lose her, has the fear of abandonment, and that's why he needs to control her. Of course, it can also be the other sex, but needs to control her. Okay. And that's why
and she needs to be loved.
Yes.
The victims of trauma bonding are love addicts. They're love addicts. Mm-hmm. They need to be loved. When they are not loved, they feel dead inside. Mm-hmm. But they mislabel, they misinterpret many behaviors as love when they're not. They see love everywhere where it is not. For example, they mistake dependency for love. They mistake abuse for love. They mistake romantic jealousy for love. Because they are so addicted to love, and because they feel alive only when they are in a dramatic, extreme love relationship, they tend to see love everywhere, in every behavior, and with everyone. That's why I told you that trauma bonding is a form of addiction, and can explain, is a major mechanism in every addiction. Because there is a love affair between the alcoholic and his alcohol, absolutely and definitely. Anyone, I worked with alcoholics for 10 years, anyone who had witnessed an alcoholic, when he sees alcohol, when he glances, he sees a bottle, it's love. Love is in the air. So, and we call it cathexis. The clinical term is cathexis. There is emotional investment in the process of loving. The trauma bonded victim loves to be in love. She is emotionally invested in loving. Never mind who, never mind what, she must love.
Why is that?
Because she feels dead. She has no existence except through the gaze of another person. It is the gaze of another person that defines her, and that convinces her that she exists. When she is not loved, and again, she misinterprets what is love. She calls many things love which are not love. But okay, when she believes that she is not loved, there is no external gaze, and she feels that she is not seen. And because she is not seen, she doesn't exist. She falls apart. She disintegrates. It's a process called decompensation. The borderline, the narcissist, many other mental health disorders, the glue that holds them together is another person's gaze. The narcissist needs other people for narcissistic supply, attention. The borderline needs other people to regulate her emotions and moods. When these people are not loved, quote unquote, by another person, there is no glue and they fall to pieces and they feel dead, totally dead.
And with totally dead, you mean, is it like a form of total disconnect to the world, intense loneliness? What is it that?
The clinical terms are emotional numbing and reduced affect display. They feel that they don't have sufficient energy to manifest. It's like they feel that they are in such a low level of energy that they can't prove to other people that they exist. Because we communicate to other people all the time that we exist. It takes energy.
Mm.
You know, we are talking right now.
Yeah.
You are communicating to me that you exist, and I'm communicating to you that I exist, and we are both using energy to do this.
Mm-hmm.
The love addict, when she is not loved or believes that she is not loved, her level of energy is so low that she cannot communicate even her existence to other people, even to herself. She cannot convince herself that she exists. So she wants to die. She wants to die, hence self-harming, self-mutilation, because it's the only way to feel alive again. It's like, if I don't have love, I can have pain. Pain is like love, because love makes me feel alive and pain makes me feel alive. So love is pain and pain is love. That is the foundation of trauma bonding. The misidentification of love with pain and pain with love.
So they need fuel, basically, right? To feel this energy.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you often hear the term narcissistic supply, which is to be seen and all these things. But on the other hand, you have also the abused persons. That person also needs supply. So both need supply, basically.
The abused person needs, yes, needs, you could think of the abused person's version of love as supply. Yes, because to be seen. You're right. It's to be seen. Yeah.
To be seen, to be regulated, all these things. And could we state that, because you said many people who get in a trauma bonded relationship and have a sense of agency or are generally healthy can get out and will get out. Some people actually stay in it because they gain something out of it. So are these people mostly people with borderline or codependency or a specific disorder? What are the factors?
Obviously, people with regulatory disturbances, regulatory disorders, such as borderline personality disorder, dependent personality disorder, also known as codependency. The codependent has difficulty to regulate her needs. She outsources her needs to an intimate partner. The borderline has trouble to regulate her emotions and her labile moods. So she outsources the regulatory function to an intimate partner. So these kind of disorders definitely are much more likely to end up in trauma bonding. But the truth is that even healthy people can end up in trauma bonding. Even healthy people, depending on the period in life that you find yourself. For example, healthy people who have just undergone a major crisis are very vulnerable. And clinically, they have a borderline personality structure for a while. Because immediately after trauma, in post-traumatic state, or immediately after crisis, there are severe problems in regulation. There are dysregulated emotions and so on. So clinically, if you wish, we are in a borderline state. So if you find a healthy person and she's just went through a horrible crisis, I don't know, she lost her child, for example, she's vulnerable. Now, every predator knows this. Every pickup artist know this. They know to go to a bar, find women who drink alone, and they know, find a woman who is crying, and they know that she's vulnerable. And they home in on the vulnerability, and they leverage it, and they abuse it. So vulnerable people, whether they're vulnerable lifelong, like borderlines, or whether they're vulnerable in a specific period of time, they can end up trauma bonded.
Okay. It's very interesting. And then I'm wondering if someone has the tendency to choose these types of relationships. By the way, is the abuser always a narcissist?
As I said, some abusers have personality disorders, some abusers have other mental health issues, for example, bipolar disorder. But I would say that majority of abusers, the abuse in majority of abusers is not connected to mental health issues. It's a way of functioning in relationships that has to do with communication skills, attachment style, fear of abandonment, early childhood trauma or problems with object constancy, predilections. For example, if you're schizoid, you don't like people, and you end up with an intimate partner. Intimate partner is a person, you don't like people, so you're going to take it out on her. So abuse is a behavior. It's not a mental health diagnosis. And it's not necessarily connected to mental health issues. All narcissists, and all borderlines are abusers. All psychopaths, of course, are abusers. So all people with cluster B personality disorders are typically abusers, but not all abusers have cluster B personality disorder.
And then trauma bonding, the way you have described it, is in a way is a codependency, right? Because they are dependent upon each other.
It's a dependency. It's not codependency in the sense that the abuser is not attached to the abused. The abuser can replace the abused any minute through the process of idealization, devaluation. So he idealizes her in order to captivate her, and then he can just devalue her. And so to the abuser, who is abusing is not very important. The act of abuse is important. The act of abuse gives the abuser comfort, because when he abuses, he feels that he's in control. He feels he will not be abandoned. He feels his anxiety is going down. It is the act of abuse, not the target of the abuse, that is important. Today I abuse you, tomorrow I abuse someone else. It doesn't matter. I just need to abuse. It's like making money, you know? You can make money from one business, and then the next day you can make money from another business. It's not the business that matters. It's the process of making money. It's the same with abuse. So it's codependency is a very misleading term, which is why, by the way, we never use it in clinical settings or academia. I'm a professor. I never use this phrase because it implies reciprocity, codependency, like both parties are dependent, which is very misleading, because in majority of dependency situations, only one party is dependent. In trauma bonding, only the abused party loves the abuser. The abuser has no emotions, no attachment, nothing towards the abused. He just uses her. He uses her as a punching bag. You know, he punches her, that's all. He needs to abuse. Now, if I'm an abuser, I need to abuse. You happen to be there. Bad for you. Your problem. You happen to be there. If you move away and another woman enters the frame, I will abuse her. No problem. I just need to abuse. Example, yes? I don't need to abuse you, but I'm saying as an example.
But then I understand also this might be hard for people who are abused to hear, because they often have this hope that their partner loves them, their abuser loves them. But from what I understand also from your videos, which were very insightful, is that the abuser doesn't form an attachment to them. It's an attachment to what he has, the snapshot he has from them. So he never really cared. And what you're describing, he cared about the abuse, the feeling of control, not necessarily about the other person. Is that correct?
That is correct for all abusers, by the way, not only narcissists. All abusers, abuse is a power play. It's a control strategy. It has very little to do with the target of abuse. Now, the targets of abuse, they want to feel special. They want to feel unique because they have their own grandiose narcissistic defenses. And they want to make sense of what happened. They want what happened to have meaning. They want the abuse to make some sense. So they say, I'm being abused because I'm highly empathic. I'm being abused because I'm kind. I've been abused because I'm a nice person. I've been chosen to be abused. I haven't been abused randomly. I haven't been abused accidentally. I've been abused because I've been chosen. They want to convince themselves that what happened makes sense. But here's the breaking news. Abuse doesn't make sense. And the abuse victims are not chosen. They just happen to be there conveniently. There is no commonality. There is no typology of abuse victims. We have a we have a field called victimology. And in victimology, we study profiles of victims. And when it comes to abuse in intimate relationships, there is no typical profile. Everyone can be abused. Anyone can be abused. Empathic and non-empathic. Good people and bad people. Anyone can end up being a victim of abuse. So you're not special as a victim of abuse. You've not been chosen. You just happen to be there. That is very difficult to hear because it means that the abuse was random, accidental, meaningless, senseless. And so your life was ruined by an accidental occurrence, by some random event, and you can't digest this. You can't digest this because you attribute to the abuser humanity. But when the abuser abuses, he is not human in any sense I'm aware of. For example, we have demonstrated that during episodes of abuse, there is a total lack of empathy, even when the abuser is otherwise empathic. So when the abuse happens, exactly during the abuse, he's totally disempathic. He's also self-centered. He becomes highly grandiose and self-centered during the episodes of abuse. It is another very interesting observation that is a bit under-analyzed. Abusers are like multiple personality. They have one personality when they are not abusing, and a totally different personality when they're abusing, which makes it impossible for the victim to comprehend what happened. I can't believe that he did this. Otherwise, when he's not abusive, he's a wonderful man. He's loving, he's caring, he's supportive, he gave me everything. And then he broke my arm, or destroyed me verbally, and I can't put the two together. It's like two personalities. And yes, she's right. There are self-states, what I call self-states. There are self-states. The abuser, when he abuses, is not the same person as the abuser when he is not abusing. And that's very, very difficult to comprehend and accept. Because you see, if you're a victim and you need to give up on the abuser, you need to break up, you need to walk away, you're giving up also on the good personality. You're not giving up only on the bad personality. It's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. If you give up on Mr. Hyde, you're also giving up on Dr. Jekyll. When you give up on the abuser, you also give up on a wonderful man. Because there are periods when he's a wonderful man, and there are periods when he's a monster. You give up on the monster, you give up on the wonderful man also. It's a package deal. Can you do that? Many victims can't. They say, okay, he's a monster sometimes, but he's also the most wonderful man I ever met. And I'm not willing to give up on this. I'm willing to pay the price to be with the monster every 3 weeks,
So there's a lot of denial going on there for the victims, basically. It reminds me, I've been working in addiction, and it's always important then to realize what are the disadvantages from the addictive behavior. And you need to really come clean. in a way. And so these people also really need to come clean with reality, really need to see what it is. And I also have had clients who were so, and perhaps now I understand this is very positive development, and that coming out of such a relationship, they feel so bad about themselves, they feel so ashamed that they have allowed this to happen. But at least there's a realization there. They're realizing what happened and that it was in a way useless, but they feel so bad about it. Yeah.
Shame and guilt, ego incongruent emotions. Shame and guilt, on the one hand, indicate facing reality, which is always good. But on the other hand, they can indicate an attempt to take responsibility for what happened, to feel responsible, to feel guilty for what happened, to feel ashamed because you could have behaved differently or you could have made different choices or so. And this I don't encourage in my clients. Because I tell them, when you take responsibility for what had happened, you're trying to reassume control. You're trying to say, my abuse was my fault. I controlled it. I could have prevented it. I'm ashamed and guilty and responsible because I did not prevent it. But the truth is you couldn't. On the one hand, you must accept reality. You must face reality. But on the other hand, you must realize that there was sometimes very little that you could have done. And in most cases, you're not responsible and you're not guilty and you're not to be ashamed. And most people would have behaved identically to you. So I don't encourage shame and guilt because these are disguised attempts to assume control of a situation which was actually out of control. It's another way of avoiding reality. In effect, it's saying, yes, I have been abused. I accept reality. I've been abused, but it was my fault. I controlled it, which is another way of avoiding reality, because in reality, the victim has no control or very little control. The only thing the victim can do profitably is walk away. If absent this, if the victim stays in the relationship, there's extremely little the victim can do. So that's where there's a thin line between shame, guilt, responsibility, accountability, saying, yeah, I contributed to this situation by, for example, making bad choices. Okay, but up to a point. Beyond that point, it's falsifying reality. It's saying, I provoked him. I was in control. Or I chose the wrong partner. I could have not chosen this partner. Or it's all I. You know, it's like I was the god in the situation, which is wrong.
So a reason that people tend to do that, to take that control back, is because they struggle so much to really accept what happened and grieve the loss of the illusion, of the hope, everything.
It's multiple grief. It's multiple grief. First of all, they grieve their own helplessness. There's a lot of shame in helplessness. Even if it is justified and objective and could not have been avoided, there's still a lot of shame. They grieve the fantasy that is lost. They grieve themselves because they have been changed irreversibly and, you know, they've been damaged. They grieve this. They grieve what could have been, the dream. They grieve the abuser. There's a lot of grief about the abuser. They still see the good sides of the abuser, the child in the abuser. They still love the abuser or believe that they love the abuser. And so there's a lot of grieving over the abuser and the abuser's wasted potential. Not only the abuser is a lost intimate partner, but what the abuser could have been had he not been an abuser. There is grief about lost time and opportunities, lost social connections, lost family, losses. So the grief, this is the most profound form of grief. When you exit a trauma-bonded relationship, it's by far the most profound form of grief. If you lose a child, you grieve the child, you grieve the child's lost potential, you grieve your love for the child, etc., etc. But this is limited grief. When you lose the fantasy that was the trauma bonding, you lose your entire universe, past, present, and future. Because in your mind, the trauma bonded relationship was a fantasy about to happen in a process of becoming, and it will never ever happen. It's also a huge loss. And you lose yourself. You're no longer you. Sometimes you don't recognize yourself. So you lost yourself as well. And you lost the person you loved. Your abuser. So there's a cognitive dissonance here. How can I mourn or grieve someone who had abused me? Is something wrong with me? Is something wrong with my appraisal of the situation? Because now I don't trust myself. I don't trust my judgment. I don't trust my reality testing. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe he was not an abuser. Maybe he didn't abuse me. Maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I provoked him. Maybe. So there's a lot of maybes, you know. It's extremely disorienting, extremely. And profound. It's called, by the way, in the DSM, the text revision that was published a few weeks ago, they put finally the prolonged grief syndrome. Finally, it's there officially. And I think victims of trauma bonding, they undergo prolonged grief syndrome, not regular grief, prolonged grief. I think we have to break up.
Okay.
Okay. So yeah, we'll say a temporary goodbye.
Okay.
See you soon. Hello, Stephanie. Welcome back.
Thank you. Okay.
So you warned me that you have a question.
I have a question, yeah. So you've explained a lot about how it is for the person that is abused and how hard it is to get out, and also the grief, how hard that is. Yeah, a lot of things happening for such a person, and you're saying something very important, that people should not blame themselves. They got into it, and the only thing they can do is get out of it. But if they don't have any influence on it, that can also be a little bit of a hopeless position, because that means that they can get into such an abusive relationship next time again, right? So my question is, are people missing red flags? Can they do anything to prevent it next time?
Loneliness is the key. Loneliness is the key. I think majority of abuse victims found themselves in abusive relationships because they implicitly, unconsciously, if you wish, thought that anything is better than being lonely. In other words, they ignored red flags and red warnings. They compromised. They lowered their standards or eliminated their standards. They ignored incidents of abuse early on. All this, I think, the core issue is a terror of being alone, terror of loneliness. Because when these people, the abuse victims, are alone, they feel dead. They equate loneliness with a form of death. It's like being dead. Terror of loneliness is a very bad advisor. And I know that there are many therapies for abuse victims. You know, this and that, and how to reframe, and how to understand your contribution, and how to avoid, how to behave in abusive relationship, and how to leave abusive relationship. And it's all very fine and needed, definitely. But I think we need prophylactics. We need to prevent abuse, or we need to prevent abusive relationships. And the only way to do this is to teach people to be perfectly okay with being alone. About 40% of the adult population nowadays is alone for life. 31% are lifelong singles, and another 7%, more or less, exit relationships and remain and become lifelong singles. About 38% of adult population. It's a gigantic number. More and more people will tell you that it's impossible to find intimate partners. As the more dating apps we have, the less proper dating we have. It's a disaster zone. Finding a partner today is a disaster for a variety of reasons, which I will not go into. We are, as a society, we're denying this problem. And instead of saying, listen, this is the situation, half the population is going to be alone for life. Now let's teach people loneliness skills. Let's teach people how to cope with being alone, how to be happy alone, how to engage themselves, how to entertain themselves, how to find meaning in life being alone, to find meaning outside relationships, how not to rely on other people for regulation, how not to rely on other people for sustenance and support, how to accept that the modern way of life is atomized, lonely, and that's it. End of story. We didn't do this.
Perhaps you can make it community-based, but at least it's not so fixed on a partner. This is a very interesting perspective, because there's so much emphasis on relationships and dating apps, and this is very new. I've never heard this perspective, that this is reality, and we are basically denying such a big aspect of it.
We are denying many things. For example, take climate change. We're denying climate change. We're saying, we're not denying climate change. We're saying there is a problem with climate change, but we can prevent it. We can reduce emissions, and by reducing emissions, we will prevent the catastrophe. It's too late. We cannot prevent the catastrophe. Why not accept it? Why not prepare for the inevitable? So we are doing this in all major crises. We pretend that we still have the power, we still have the control, we can still reverse, we can still cure, we can still heal, we can still, we can still fix climate change. We cannot fix climate change. It's out of control. We need to prepare for the inevitable apocalypse. It's the same with relationships, intimate relationships. We need to accept that half the population will never have a relationship, and we need to find meaning elsewhere. In social activism, in community-oriented enterprises, in learning, in traveling, in I don't know in what, but we need to provide alternatives. Today, we are broadcasting that if you don't have sex, something is wrong with you. If you don't have a relationship, you're defective, you're deformed, you're dysfunctional. That's wrong messaging. That's wrong messaging. If you don't have a relationship, either you're not built for a relationship, and many people are not, or you had bad luck and you have to live with it. And you have to survive somehow, and you have to function, and you have to love yourself, despite the bad luck. Bad luck is not your fault. You have to accept that the world is not just, But the terror of loneliness propagated by the mass media, by show business, by Hollywood, and so on, the terror of loneliness pushes people to make very, very bad decisions in mate selection, and then even worse decisions within relationships. If loneliness was legitimized and sexlessness was legitimized, many people would have been much happier. And this is the situation. I think people, you're right, are ignoring. Listen, let me tell you something. You have all the information you need on the first date. When you meet someone and you spend more than 2 hours with him, you have all the information you need on that first date. However, if you are terrified of loneliness, you would tend to suppress this information, ignore it, reframe it, justify it, rationalize it. You tend to play games with it because you wouldn't tolerate it. You would lower your standards. You would compromise. You would do something, because better to be with an abuser than being alone. So abusers broadcast their problems very early on. The way the abuser interacts with the waiter in a restaurant, the way he talks to a cab driver, the way he orders you about, he tells you what to do and what not to do in a first meeting, the way he decides which restaurant you go to, the way he interrogates you after you come back from the toilet, from the restroom. All these are bad signs. All these are warning signs. He doesn't accept the boundaries.
The way he's not interested in what you feel like doing.
Yes, or talks about himself all the time.
Mm-hmm.
These are warning signs, and abusers cannot suppress these warning signs for more than a few minutes. It's a myth. It's a myth that abusers are very good at camouflage. It's not true. Mm-hmm. If you are with an a-hole, if you are with a jerk, if you're with a narcissist, it comes out in the first 15 minutes. And that is if he's very good in acting. So, and if you're ignoring these signs, you're ignoring these signs because you feel compelled to ignore these signs. And you feel compelled to do this because you're terrified of the alternative. You should compromise. Of course you should compromise. Life is a compromise. But you should never compromise on your well-being. You should never compromise on your health, physical or mental. You should never compromise on abuse in any form, even if it is directed not at you, but at third parties. If you see your date abusing a waiter, walk away. That's an abuser.
But then the question will be, I can imagine that these people who are so afraid of loneliness, of not ending up alone, not being in a relationship, they would prefer everything to that.
Yes.
Yes. So they need to, even if when they get out of such a relationship, they really need to make a decision for themselves. Am I really willing again to self-sacrifice in order to be in such a illusion for the outside world, for not coping myself? They also need to make a decision themselves, and society should change the focus a little bit.
Yes, and you see that there is the rate of recidivism is very high. People who have been in one abusive relationship are likely to be in many abusive relationships. They go from one abusive relationship to another. By the way, the same goes for romantic cheating, for cheating. People who cheat once are 3 times more likely to cheat again. We create habits and neural pathways. We habituate. So if your comfort zone is abuse, you're likely to seek abusers. The minute you enter an abusive relationship, you begin to lie to yourself. You begin to deceive yourself. You begin to somehow accommodate yourself to the abuse. You normalize the abuse. You legitimize the abuse. And then all future abuse by future abusers would look normal and legitimate.
Especially if that's what you've witnessed as a child. But I'm wondering, so why would someone meets a wonderful person, you know, real love as in respectful, honest, accepting you for the way you are, how you are, and then you have an abuser type? Why would someone choose the abuser then over the healthy partner? Because
no abuser presents a facade of only abuse. That's the intermittent reinforcement. Mm-hmm. That's what I said, the double personality. Mm-hmm. There is a wonderful man element coupled with a horrible monster element.
But why choose someone with a combination when you can also choose one that has the love without the abuse?
Because the presentation is extreme. The abuser presents an extremely wonderful man.
Mm. The love bombing and everything.
Yes, it's extremely wonderful. Mm. And the alternatives are average. Mm. The abuser is extreme, he's dramatic. That's why we call personality disorders, cluster B, we call them dramatic erratic, because they're dramatic. So you come across an abuser. Yes, he will abuse you horribly. It's also extreme. But when he's wonderful, there will be no one else like him. Mm. He will be the Mr. Wonderful. No one will come close to him as a wonderful person, and no one will come close to him as a monster.
Okay, so it's a dopamine rush as well.
Yes,
Effective.
It's you get addicted. That's what I'm saying. Like alcohol, you get addicted. It's a substance. The abuser becomes a substance. You know, you consume the abuser the way you consume coke or opioids.
That's why it's so important for people to not confuse, as they say, drama with excitement, right?
That's what I opened. My opening statement in our conversation was that people confuse intensity with truth. They say if it is intense, it's real. If it's intense, it's real. So they say, oh, he's so intense, it must mean that he is real, he's authentic. But no, it could be acting, or it could be compulsion. Compulsion is very intense, but it's pathological, it's sick. I don't know, serial killers are very intense. Psychotics are very intense. Intensity is not an indicator of mental health and is not an indicator of reality. It's just indicator of intensity. That's all. But people confuse. When you talk to abuse victims, they say that when he was wonderful, there was no one like him. He was the ideal man. He was the love of my life. He was the perfect match. He was my soulmate. He was my twin flame. He was, I don't know what.
Yes.
When he was wonderful, which is 70, 80% of the time. Abusers abuse like 10% of the time, 3% of the time, 5% of the time, 85% of the time, 95% of the time. They are the ultimate partner, the perfect partner. And so it's very difficult to give up on the package.
And I'm also wondering, could it be that with an abusive person, usually that person is not really interested in you and who you are and what you need, while a healthy person is interested in you. And that can be, with wounded people, can be scary as well, because you don't like yourself. So perhaps these healthy people come very close and the abuser stays at a safe distance. The love bombing is not being interested in you as a person, right?
There is what we call the dual anxiety, for example, in borderline, there's abandonment anxiety or separation insecurity, and there is engulfment anxiety. This fear of intimacy, dread of intimacy, is prevalent, is pervasive in multiple mental health disorders. The fear of intimacy can be because you consider yourself less than perfect. So if someone comes to know you, they'll run away because they will see that you're less than perfect. The fear of intimacy could be because intimacy had been associated with pain in childhood. So you anticipate pain, you anticipate rejection, humiliation, cheating, betrayal. So fear of intimacy could be because it doesn't fit a specific narrative. For example, if you consider yourself to be superior, controlling, intimacy compromises you because it exposes vulnerabilities. So what I'm trying to say is there are multiple reasons to fear intimacy. And so yes, the relationship with an abuser is a relationship between two fantasies, between two internal objects, not real. The two parties don't see each other. The abused doesn't see the abuser also.
So there's a safe distance.
Yes, it's self-love. That's why I said at the beginning, this is a process of self-loving, not other loving. It's not object relations. It's not loving the other. It's loving how you see yourself through the other, how you see yourself through the other's gaze. And when you talk to abuse victims, they will tell you the way he looked at me, the way he saw me, no one has ever seen me like that. No one has looked at me like that. They are in love with themselves through the eyes of the abuser. And similarly, the abuser is in love, is implementing the fantasy. Is a child, and the abused one is the mother. So both of them are focused on themselves, their internal processes, their needs, their images, their fantasies. They don't have time to see the other. They're too busy managing themselves in this joint fantasy. In a movie, it's a movie. Like the actors, in a movie, in a real movie, they often shoot scenes out of order, not chronologically. And very often they shoot one party and then the other party, and they put them together as if they were having a dialogue. This is exactly the abusive relationship. The two actors say their lines and are not aware of the presence of the other actor. The ultimate director put them together, but they go through their own lines. They have their own script, and the other person is just an excuse to implement the script. It's very difficult for victims to hear this, because they want to believe that they had meant something to the abuser. They want to believe the abuser had some kind of connection or emotion or attachment or bond. They want to believe that they're special somehow, or at least were special to the abuser. They want to believe all these things, but the truth is they were never there. The truth is the abuser never noticed their existence. They were like an object, a punching bag, an excuse. They were like a trigger. They didn't have a separate existence in the eyes of the abuser. They were manipulable internal object. This is terrifying to the victim because it means that she never existed. And anyhow, the victims have a fear that maybe they don't exist. They need another person's gaze to feel that they exist. And here, the abusive relationship implies that they never existed. So maybe really they don't exist. It's existential angst, you know. Do I exist or not?
Yeah. So these people need to reevaluate that relationship and see how they actually weren't seen. Yes. And start to identify when someone perhaps is less exciting, less of a dopamine rush, but actually does take into account how they feel, that they are really interested. Perhaps it won't be love bombing, but it will be someone really being interested in how they make you feel, which is a big difference.
It's an enormous difference, but these are addicts. Coming back to the beginning of our previous segment where I said that, you know, these are addicts. I said that they are love addicts. They're addicted. So a normal, average person, potential intimate partner, would not excite them. They would be bored to death. They would not be sexually aroused. They would not be infatuated. There would be no drama. They would walk away. They can't have this. No. So the people who find themselves in trauma bonding for good reason. They love the drama. They love the fantasy. They love the self-harm. They love walking on the brink of death, between life and death. They love to feel that they are alive and they exist because they're mutilated. They love all this. When they come across a truly loving person, a person who really sees them, really admires or loves them for who they are, it's boring. It's boring. They can't stand it. They just want to run away.
That triggers them not being alive again, which is their worst nightmare. So that's why therapy would be so crucial if they want to break this pattern, this dependency, this addiction.
There is a risk. Excellent that you raise this point. There is a serious risk of trauma bonding in therapy. As you well know, you're a clinical psychologist. The initial phases of therapy involve transference, and there is a kind of bonding that takes place, or attachment that takes place between patient and therapist, even the best therapists, with boundaries, with therapeutic alliance, with all the defenses. Even there, the patient develops transference, develops emotions, projects onto the therapist dynamics, psychological dynamics from her life, and so on. So there's transference. Inevitably, there's counter-transference. The therapist reacts to this. Never mind how trained and how supervised and how we name it, still reacts to it. There's a dynamic developing. And it is an intimate dynamic. Exactly like in every other intimate relationship. There is a tremendous risk of trauma bonding. If the therapist is unboundaried, untrained, and so on, if the patient is very forceful and invasive and intrusive and aggressive, there is a serious risk that the therapeutic relationship will deteriorate into a simulation of trauma bonding in an intimate relationship. And I must say, and I'm sorry to say, that from my experience, I'm 26 years in this racket, from my experience, many therapists don't know the line, don't cross the boundary. And in many therapeutic situations, there are very perverse or wrong, bad dynamics as far as the patient is concerned. Many. I wish I could say it's a minority. It's not a minority. In many. There could be, for example, a situation where the therapist would consider herself or himself to be a savior or a fixer or a healer.
Yes.
There could be a situation where the therapist would react adversely to the patient and create trauma. Doesn't like the patient. You know, there could be a situation where the patient would impose a traumatic overstructure, superstructure on the therapy. She would do something very traumatizing. You know, so she would introduce trauma into. She would, for example, commit suicide in the clinic, or try to commit suicide in the clinic. You know, and that's an extreme example, but there are many ways to create trauma, artificial trauma in the. So the therapy is more intimate than most intimate relationships I know. And the risks are there. Don't think that just because you're a therapist, you have control over the situation. Absolutely, the risks are there. Not to mention the situations where therapists cross the lines and begin to have sexual liaisons, or romantic liaisons with patients. I'm not talking about this. This is minority. But even in standard therapy.
So you're saying that it's very important to identify, first of all, the dynamics of a dependent person, basically, we're talking about, right? And then also it's important to identify if that person actually comes there to really change or just create a new dependency. And then it's up to the therapist to be able to have good supervision and intervision to try to stay out of these dynamics, I suppose.
Yes, if the patient expects you to regulate her, to save her, to replace an intimate partner in some way, and so on and so forth, these are forbidden dynamics. You should tell her, I can't work with you anymore. If you have counter transfers, I can't work with you anymore. You need to find someone else.
Yeah.
That's it. And by the way, it's not gender dependent. You could have these dynamics, even if you're heterosexual, you can have these dynamics with same-sex patient. These are not gender-dependent dynamics. That's why, for example, a mother can traumatize her daughter. It's not gender-dependent. You could have trauma bonding with a mother, even though you're a daughter. So it's not about sex. It's about control dynamics and regulation dynamics.
Yes, very interesting. There's a lot of information for people out there, I can imagine.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Absolutely. It was I'm very happy that we went into the subject in such a deep way. I think it's not spoken about this in this way. So I'm very glad about that.
Yes, I think we shed some new light. I agree.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. Take care there.
Thank you. Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Long before many of you were conceived, I introduced the concept of drama bond or drama bonding into the discourse of cluster B personality disorders, especially narcissistic and borderline personality disorders. So what is drama bond or drama bonding, and what is the difference between drama bond and trauma bond? They sound the same, but are they the same? My name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited, and a professor of clinical psychology. Today we are going to go deep into the rabbit hole of drama bonding. First of all, in the description, you will find 2 additional videos that I would like you to watch. And they describe trauma bonding in a very unusual way. One is a presentation to a conference in 2021, and the other one is an interview with Stephanie Carinia, a trauma expert. Trauma bonding is an extreme experience. It is unidirectional in the sense that the victim bonds with the abuser but the abuser does not bond with the victim. In this sense, we can conceive of trauma bonding as a kind of self-harming attachment, an attachment that is self-defeating, self-destructive, self-trashing, self-mutilating, and in short, self-harming or harmful. Trauma bonding is fostered by repeated, recurrent, traumatizing, unpredictable, intermittent reinforcement experiences involving a power asymmetry. Now that's a mouthful. First of all, there has to be an element of trauma. Now, trauma is a much abused, overused, and misused word. Trauma is a subjective experience. There's no way to quantify trauma. There's no way to objectify it, to make it objective. Trauma is the way specific people, certain people, react to experiences. We could have 10 people exposed to the same experience, only one of them would be traumatized, and the other would walk away unscathed. And so trauma is a subjective experience. That means that only people with highly specific psychological profiles are bound to be traumatized. And I deal with it in numerous videos. There's a trauma playlist on this channel, which I encourage you to watch. And in the particular case of trauma bonding, the trauma is induced by mistreatment or maltreatment, especially unpredictability, what is known as intermittent reinforcement. And the unpredictability has to be a feature of a power asymmetry. In other words, the abuser holds all the power, the victim is powerless and helpless, either because she chooses to be, this is known as learned helplessness, or because there is something structural in the relationship, for example, financial dependence or common children, which render the victim essentially at the mercy of the abuser. But the unpredictability is the core. The inability to gain a modicum of certainty, determinacy in a relationship. Waking up in the morning, not knowing what to expect. This creates, of course, dependency on the abuser. The abuser holds the power to harm and hurt the victim, to inflict pain on the victim. And so the victim ingratiates herself. The victim kind of becomes submissive, obedient, obsequious. The victim kowtows and caters to the needs of the abuser, just in order to make sure that she is not abused yet again. And of course, this leads to dissonance and ambivalence. On the one hand, the victim hates the abuser for abusing her. And on the other hand, she loves the abuser. It all started with love bombing or real love, fantasy or reality, whatever the case may be. Initially, there was a real attachment between the two, the abuser and his victim, the predator and his prey. It is all founded on real attachment. So trauma bonding is a malignant, cancerous, metastatic form of healthy bonding. It is not divorced from healthy bonding. It has all the elements of healthy bonding. This is a common mistake in the literature even, let alone among self-styled experts, as if trauma bonding is something that has nothing to do with real love or with real attachment or with real bonding or with couplehood or with being in a dyad or with sharing a life with someone, companionship, and so on. That is not true. Trauma bonding has all the elements of a good, healthy, functional relationship. Support, succor, companionship, collaboration, love, attachment, bonding, you name it. It's all there. The only problem is that it is only half of the equation, only part of the equation. And the other half is comprised of abuse, verbal, psychological, sometimes physical, maltreatment, degradation, humiliation, shaming, attacking, denying the victim her agency and personal autonomy and independence and so on. So there are these two parts, one of them healthy, one of them sick, and it is this conjunction, this combination that creates the trauma bonding, because there is ambivalence there. I love him, but I hate him. He's good to me, but he's bad to me. He treats me well, he mistreats me. It all emanates from the same source, from the abuser, and it's difficult to reconcile. And because it's irreconcilable, because you can't put everything together within a cohesive, coherent framework, this causes the trauma bonding. And it is known also as identifying with the abuser. So it is a complex, trauma bonding is a complex phenomenon, because on the one hand, you're truly attached, the victim is truly attached to the abuser in a meaningful, healthy way. And on the other hand, the outcomes of this healthy attachment, this love, this companionship, this friendship, this partnership, the outcomes of all these are very bad, very negative. And when we have a discrepancy between behaviors and emotions, affects and cognitions and real life consequences, when we have this discrepancy, we tend to freeze. We tend to freeze, and we tend to get even more involved emotionally in a desperate attempt to make sense of everything, to restore order and structure and justice, to somehow imbue what's happening with meaning and purpose and direction. And so there is this, it becomes like a challenge. There is this immersion in I'm going to make this work, or I'm going to solve this, I'm going to make sense of this. And above all, the source of the pain, the source of the hurt, is also the source of the comfort. So you can't let go of one without letting go of the other. The very person in the trauma bonding, the abuser, the perpetrator, the one who inflicts on the victim immeasurable pain, agony, torture, is the very person who holds the key to her happiness and contentment and comforting and soothing. And so this creates, of course, dependency. Dissonance and ambivalence are the core reactions and engines of trauma bonding. Don't forget another thing. Narcissists create introjects in the mind of the victim. They use training to create in the mind of the victim a representation of themselves. So the narcissist has an ally inside the victim's mind. It's like installing an app on a smartphone. And this introject, this voice, this representation of the narcissist in the victim's mind colludes with the narcissist, collaborates with the narcissist. And because the narcissist perceives himself to be a victim, the introject that represents the narcissist in the victim's mind is also an introject of victimhood. In other words, the narcissist's internal voice in the victim's mind keeps saying, you wronged me, you victimized me, you are the abuser. And so the victim feels guilty, she feels remorseful, she doubts herself for no good reason. She asks herself, am I really the narcissist? Am I the abuser? Have I done something wrong? Could I have behaved differently? And so on. This is another reason for the bonding. As long as the victim feels that she is responsible for what's happening and that she should be held accountable for the predicament that she finds herself in, then of course she would continue in the relationship. She would become more and more bonded and attached to the abuser, because she would unconsciously even perceive the abuser as having been victimized by her. She would feel remorse and regret, and she would attempt to compensate the abuser for her own misbehavior, for her misconduct, and for the abuse that she has meted out to the abuser. So it's a hall of mirrors. It's very disorienting. And what do we do when we get disoriented? We freeze. Trauma bonding is a freeze reaction. A freeze reaction writ large, simply put. And you could conceive of trauma bonding as a form of self-mutilation or self-harm, as I said, replete with the same three functions: to numb dysregulated emotions that threaten to overwhelm the victim, to allow the victim to feel alive through pain, and to punish, defeat, and destroy herself. It's self-punitive. Okay, this is a general introduction to trauma bonding. And now we come to drama bonding. Drama bonding is not the same as trauma bonding, although it may involve traumatic figments or traumatic elements. Drama bonding is equally extreme, as radical, as colorful, if you wish, as trauma bonding. But it is bidirectional, whereas trauma bonding is from the abuser to the abused. In drama bonding, there's a collusion, there's a collaboration between the two participants in the drama, or the three or whatever, usually it's two. The two participants work together to create the drama, to engender it, to foster it. They write the plot of the drama, and then together, and then they implement it together, and then they bask in the drama together. They absorb its effects and consequences together. They react affectively and cognitively almost in the same way. And in this sense, drama bond or drama bonding is at the core of cults, actually. So in cults, you have both trauma bonding and drama bonding, because cults are about drama and they are bidirectional. Exactly like trauma bonding, drama bonding is a self-harming attachment. And it is self-harming because drama is the antonym, is the opposite of personal growth and development. When you are immersed in a dramatic, erratic, crazy-making situation, there's no time for evolution, personal evolution, for learning, for insight, there's no time for all this. It's a survival mode. You're fighting, you're coping. So drama is a distraction away from the regular course of life. And drama is also counterfactual. It's not realistic. It drives you away from reality. It's unhealthy. It's pathological. Like trauma bonding, drama bonding is fostered by experiences. As I said, some of these experiences may be traumatic. Some of these experiences are unpredictable. Some of these experiences are intermittent. So there's intermittent reinforcement involved. And in this sense, drama bonding is very similar or resembles trauma bonding. But there are additional things in drama bonding which usually cannot be found in trauma bonding. For example, in trauma bonding, the abuser engages with the victim. I would say that trauma bonding involves over-engagement, too much engagement, a hostile takeover, a merger, a fusion, an enmeshment. Whereas in drama bonding, there is object withdrawal. Object withdrawal is the opposite of object constancy. In other words, the participants in the drama sometimes withdraw from each other, avoid each other, and this generates the drama. Most of these dramas are actually founded on avoidance, on an attachment style that is dismissive or fearful or anxious. So the drama is a reaction to the potential for loss. It's a reaction for the anticipation of loss, of abandonment, of rejection. And so object withdrawal is critical here. You could also say that drama bonding is the reactive pattern to separation insecurity or abandonment anxiety, which is not the case in trauma bonding. In trauma bonding, the abuser makes clear that he is in the victim's life, intends to stay there, maybe teach her a lesson, maybe he's angry at her, maybe he's abusive and punitive and so on, but he's always there. He is too much there. He is in control. He is the victim. He seeks to annihilate the victim and become one with her. Annihilate her by becoming one with her. That's not the case in drama. In drama bonding, in many cases, the threat, the menace is, wow, I'm going to lose him. I'm going to lose her. They're about to walk away. It's on the verge of a breakup. So, object withdrawal. Similarly, drama bonding, drama, as the name implies, drama, it's a drama. It's a theater production. It's a movie. There's a structural narrative fantasy that underlies the drama. In trauma bonding, trauma with a T, in trauma bonding, it's exactly the opposite. There is no narrative. The potency, the force of the trauma bond is because it's unpredictable. It's intermittent. It's crazy making. It has no story, no sense, no meaning, no connectivity, no explanation. It's totally insane. It's nuts. Whereas in the drama bond, there is definitely a story, a narrative, a fantasy, and they're rigid. They're rigid. That's why drama bond or drama bonding is common in cults. It's a rigid narrative, and both participants in the drama adhere to the narrative, accept the rules of this concocted universe, this alternative or virtual reality. If you want to watch drama bonding in action, I advise you to watch the movie Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf with Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton. Amazing movie. 1967, I think, but amazing movie. The best depiction I've ever seen of both trauma bonding and drama bonding in a couple. And you will see there that both participants adhere to something, to a story. And it is as if they're going through the motions, as if they're following some kind of scripted thing, like they're on a movie set. So it doesn't feel real most of the time. And sometimes they say something and you can see in their eyes and body language that they're like, what the hell am I doing? I mean, why am I doing this? It's as if they're controlled from the outside, but by some director, as if the whole thing is a simulation of some kind, with a demented coder behind it. So the drama bond feels a little dissociative, feels a little like not real, unreal. And because it is like this, it involves a lot of uncertainty, indeterminacy, insecurity. There is a power asymmetry. Even in drama bonding, there's a power asymmetry. Exactly like in what is known as shared psychosis or folie à deux. There is an inducer, there's the person who writes the script, the person who concocts the fantasy, the person who comes up with a plot of the narrative, and there is the participant, the actor. So it's like a director and a script writer and an actor or actress. So there is a division of labor, and one of the participants has more power than the other. So there is power asymmetry. And there is uncertainty, indeterminacy, insecurity, and so on and so forth, but not like in trauma bonding. In trauma bonding, the locus of uncertainty is, what is he going to do next? In trauma bonding, the question is, what is he going to do next? How is she going to behave next? Next, it's future-oriented. In drama bonding, the question is, how long is it going to last? When is it going to walk away? When is this movie going to be over and the credits roll? So it's also future-oriented, but whereas in trauma bonding, there is object constancy, in drama bonding, there is no object constancy. There's anticipation of the unwinding of the drama with the exit of one of the participants. And it leads to anxiety, not to dissonance, not to ambivalence, but to anxiety, to desperation, acting out, attempts to regain the partner within the drama. There is a hidden or implicit assumption or belief that the more dramatic you are, the more crazy making, the more you act out, the more addictive you become to your partner. You're both drama addicts. You're both drama magnets. And so it's as if the partner asks you to be dramatic, as if the participants in the drama bond have agreed to bond through drama and to gratify or satisfy each other's needs for drama. It's like both of them are enablers, each other's enablers. So you want me to be dramatic, and then you will stay in my life. You will stick around if I'm dramatic. You will never abandon me. You will never reject me. You never walk away. You never break up with me. The more dramatic I am, the more toxic I am, I'm going to be toxic. I'm going to be dramatic just to keep you in my life. And this is the essence of drama bonding. Okay, I did my traumatizing best to explain the differences between trauma bonding and drama bonding. I'm open to questions in the comments section and to making another video in the future should your questions address lacunas or anything I've missed. Okay, it's been a very traumatizing video, but very dramatic, and I hope you've bonded with me even more than before.